Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the rain came pelting down vigorously in large torrents. Transfixed, I watched it gliding down the window panes, covering the glass and spatters of opaque droplets. I could hear the swishing sound of the water gushing down the drain pipes, the distant rumbles of thunder. My uncle's golden retriever Carmel, undaunted by the growling Bellicrose smoky grey gloomy sky, was lying blissfully fast asleep on the flagstone floor of the very large, stylic, rustic-looking kitchen, with its bright red kitchen range, zooty kitchen cupboards, and golden-brown bespeckled granite islands. Not to mention the pièce de résistance, a huge wooden oak table, where I was now sitting. Carmel's long, soft, luxurious, creamy hair brushed against my feet, as a low snore emerged from the back of his throat. Everything in the yard was luxuriously green, the raindrops saturating the earth, causing even the turf to twinkle. It looked as if someone had turned on a power hose, washed all the dust away, for the plants and flowers looked brighter, crisper, greener, fresher, more vibrant from this rain. The clusters of spring daffodils were bowing their flowery heads, subserviently under the weight of the raindrops, while some of the beds of pansies looked like they'd taken a stiff beating. But once the sun burst through the cobalt blue sky, and the grey sky finally receded, those flowers would look brighter, fresher than ever. I enjoyed staying at my uncle's Colorado ranch-style farmhouse, situated unapologetically in the midst of the glorious countryside, not too far away from a town, so in short a perfect location. Yet for me it was the indispensable consummate escapism that I was so desperately seeking, a true break from the chaotic chaos of my everyday life that seemed to swallow, devour, consume me with the gusto of a Californian wildfire. I deplored my job, a whole world away from the spectacular Colorado ranch, in the city of Boston, with a fervent passion, working for a demanding boss, as his personal secretary, who insisted on meeting last-minute deadlines, even if it meant quite literally that I was tearing my hair out in frustration. It would seem the daunting, all-consuming, unabating workload never seemed to stop piling up like the dirty sports gear in a very active footballer's laundry basket. There were times I had felt so weighted down, encumbered, overwhelmed by the work, that I had secret fantasies of just marching into my boss's office with a feisty swagger, just throwing the files on his desk and saying, "Sorry, Mr. Falconer, but I've just had enough. You can stuff your job, put it where the sun doesn't shine." I could visualize the pain expression on his face as I stomped belligerently out of the offices, with everyone in the open space area gawking at me in horror, as if to say, "What the hell was all that about?" as I finally left the building for good, never ever to return. The reality was very different. As much as I despised my nondescript mediocre job, I knew I needed it. The pay was excellent. If I gave it up to embrace pastures new, I might not be able to afford to maintain my high standard of living that I had grown accustomed to over the years. but being miserable, depressed, permanently exhausted had become a fixture and fitting in my life. Of course, everyone on the outside looking in at my life through the dewy, fragrant, beguiling sham of rose-tinted glass windows clearly admired my lavish, sumptuous, luxurious lifestyle, falsely assuming that I had it all, the entire world at my feet. For on its elusive, enticing surface it would certainly seem that way. But then, on the surface, appearances can be exceedingly deceptive, a disingenuous, perfidious deception that you can never take at its word, or even at a fleeting glance. For not all that you see with your naked eye, or gleam on social media, is in fact as it seems. The envious looks on the faces of my friends had not escaped me, even when I drove my glamorous British racing green Jaguar down the streets of Boston. I knew that my image looked good, but that was all it was, image. As King Solomon rightly proclaimed, it was all meaningless under the sun. I could see admiring glances from people who clearly thought I was an affluent businesswoman who had absolutely everything. How wrong they were, how misguided, how misinformed. Sometimes I felt so empty, as if everything had been sucked out of me, like I was a dried-out old empty shell, robotically going through the motions of my life with a mechanical efficiency. In truth, a robot would have done a much better job than I had done. In reality, I was no more than a pathetic, glorified secretary with a fancy name, assistant director, that looked the part of a successful business executive in my smart, well-fitting Prada suits and stylish pumps. I was being paid a lot to perform like a hamster on a wheel, going round and round and round and round every day, with the same boring, drudgerous routines that made my whirling head want to explode with frustration. Worse still, both my parents loved to gloat on my account, on my so-called success. They hungrily basked in it like a pair of gluttonous Komodo dragons, shamelessly boasting about my insipid accomplishments, which were in truth as colourless as water, as bland as unsalted, flavourless popcorn. "Oh, meet my daughter," my effusive mother would gush to her listening audience, when I was at affluent social gatherings with them, like cocktail parties or barbecues. "This is my oldest daughter, Felicia. She works for the top CEO at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Seaport Boulevard." I could see my mother's chest inflate and swell with pride as she made those gainful innuendos. I would literally squirm with embarrassment, wishing that the whole ground would swallow me whole, as my mother would bumptiously brag on and on, like a washing machine at a laundromat, about my long list of masterful accomplishments that I myself did not know I'd achieved. For it would seem my mother's exaggerating tongue had run away with her, and seriously lengthened my success like the string on a piece of chewing gum that went on and on and on forever until it disappeared into the ether. The only person that I could genuinely talk to when it came to my crumbling, dilapidated life was my cousin Cynthia. She seemed to get it. She was a country girl who lived on her father's Californian cattle ranch, and would often come to Boston to stay with my mother's older sister Gretchen, who also lived there. I met up with her in town at a really trendy coffee shop 4 weeks prior, after she just came back from an exciting trip to Africa, where she had visited the Serengeti, lounged on some of Kenya's most illustrious beaches. I'd noticed that she was positively glowing from her holiday, as her skin gleamed with a natural golden tan. Her demeanour was relaxed and carefree, like the wind on a sandy beach. "Oh, there you are," she had said, rushing over enthusiastically to embrace me with a warm, energetic hug, as she threw off her overcoat on the back of the chair to sit down. She stared at me through concerned brown eyes. "You don't look good, Felicia. You're so pale and gaunt-looking. Are you sure you're all right?" "It's the work," I sighed, shrugging my shoulders in a nonchalant way. "It gets on top of me at times." All of a sudden I started to cry. This was a turn-up for the books. Even I was shocked by the sudden, unexpected emotional outburst, as rivers of tears bounded down my face at an alarming pace. It was very humiliating. Cynthia quickly opened her purse to grab some tissues for me to blot my eyes. I could hear the soft murmur of the people's voices rising and falling in the background, the sound of cutlery and china, clanging, tinkling, clinking, along with the scuttle of the rushed feet of the waitresses, as they hastily hurried across the cafe floor, to take the detailed orders from the hungry people with an impressive efficiency. "There," she said, "there you are. Your mascara's running all over the place. She dampened the tissue with her tongue, wiping away the clouds of black that had now dappled my cheeks in a contemporary design of smoky blotches and splashes that might have looked good on an artist's canvas, but not my face. Things can't be that bad, surely. I hate my job, Cynthia, I said to her, almost growling. I bloody hate it. If you must know, I keep dreaming of throwing the entire filing cabinet at Mr. Falconer, telling him to go and suck eggs. I wish I could leave that god-awful job. I feel as if I'm trapped under a falling building, like I'm suffocating from the claustrophobic oppression, that I can't breathe. I just want to scream, scream and scream. I feel so overwhelmed. The pressure of meeting all these deadlines, it's immense. It's stressing me out, seriously. You poor thing, said Cynthia, telling the waitress to bring me a tall glass of Mountain Dew as quickly as possible. Your mother's always going on to my mother about your dazzling achievements, how terribly proud she is that you work for such an illustrious company like PricewaterhouseCoopers in such a prominent high-profile position, driving around in your fancy Jag, wearing designer clothes, owning an apartment on the harbour. She seems to think you love your job, and that you're a huge, huge success. Success, I sniggered, as if the word was odious and vile. I wanted to spit it out like a bitter piece of fruit. You know my mother is so pretentious. It's absolutely pathetic. The truth is, Cynthia, anyone could do my job. Absolutely anyone. It's that mediocre, that uninspiring. I hate it. I actually hate it. In fact, hate is an injustice to the word. I despise it. I loathe it. Once again I surprised myself with more unexpected streams of tears washing down my face that completely obliterated my makeup, leaving my now mottled skin covered in ugly pink wheals. But this time many people in the coffee shop were glancing awkwardly in my direction, pretending not to look, but not being desperately discreet enough to conceal their curiosity. They were staring at me with concerned expressions on their faces, as after all, why would anyone wearing a Prada suit, Prada pumps, and a matching Prada purse have anything to be sad about at all? Is she going to be all right? The waitress asked Cynthia. Maybe a piece of chocolate cake would do the trick. Chocolate is great for grief. Good idea, said Cynthia. In that case, bring her the biggest piece of chocolate cake you've got. It would seem the waitress took my cousin literally at her word, for a slice of cake the size of a family pizza was placed in front of me, that caused a few eyebrows in the neighbouring tables to be raised. I even heard one woman saying, "Is she really going to eat all that?" Even I had to smile to myself as I stared down at the monstrosity before me, a very nice-looking one, with layers of fudge icing, whipped cream, copious, fat, juicy cherries marinated in brandy. I took a bite. I felt infinitely better about the world, as the sweet, lofty richness of the cake seemed to calm down my frazzled nerves. "You know what you need," said Cynthia, looking at me earnestly. "You need a good holiday, a break from your life in Boston. You're probably right, but my job is so busy. I can't take time off. Mr. Falconer really needs me." "That is so ridiculous," said Cynthia, growing heated as her angry face became flushed with a bright pink hue. "You're going to take time off. You hear me? You need a break from your job for your own good. If you carry on this way, you're going to have a nervous breakdown. I can't sit back and watch that happen to you. I tell you what, in 4 weeks' time our family is going abroad for 3 weeks. Why don't you move into our ranch house in Colorado? No one will disturb you. The ranch hands are in full control of running the ranch. They take care of the cattle, manning the affairs of the farm. Our ranch house is in a private space away from the working ranch, so you can stay there with Carmiel, our golden retriever, and our 2 cats for company. You'll have your own space, be able to go out for country walks, do your own thing. No one will disturb you. You need this time to be with yourself. It's very important." "It sounds like a great idea," I said, "but—" "No buts," said Cynthia, grabbing my hands. "Do you listen to me? No buts. You'll be house-sitting Carmiel, along with our 2 lackadaisical cats, but at the same time you'll have time to reflect on your life, so that when you return to Boston you can then decide whether you want to continue working for Mr. Falconer. I promise you, with some fresh air, gentle exercise, time to be quiet with yourself, you'll soon be able to decide what is best for you. In your current emotional state, your thoughts are flying all over the place like a dodgy electric connection that's firing up all wrong. You need some serious grounding, girl. Nature can do that for you, give you some meaningful perspective." Fast forward 4 weeks, and I had agreed to my cousin Cynthia's preposterous proposal that had not been so preposterous after all. On the contrary, a week into my holiday, I was beginning to really feel the benefits of being able to relax, to drink in the ravishing scenery that surrounded my uncle's home. It was wonderful to wake up, potter around the kitchen casually in my slippers, to stroke Carmiel's soft hair, get caught up with reading a novel or two on the sun lounger, take the occasional stroll in the woodgrove that framed the right-hand side of the house. Cynthia had been right. The ranch hands had given me a wide girth, left me to my own devices, were managing the ranch superbly without even a fleeting glance from me. It would appear my uncle's stunning ranch-style home, fringed by a magnificent woodgrove, along with Carmiel, the adorable, loving golden retriever, that made me feel comfortable, secure and protected, were my sanctuary for the next 3 weeks. There were a couple of old cats that mooched on the sofa all day long, that were also good company for me, as they enjoyed rolling on their backs, while I massaged their soft, fluffy underbellies, purring like little car engines. Let me assure you that a spot of laziness is very good for the soul. I was lapping it up hungrily, like a sea sponge, as I had not felt this free for a long time. I felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders, and that my hectic working life at PricewaterhouseCoopers was a distant, faint, obscure memory on the horizon. Unfortunately, Cynthia wasn't able to go abroad with her parents after all, as after her trip to Africa she had contracted hepatitis. She was convalescing with her Aunt Gretchen in Boston, was subsequently in quarantine. I did wonder if I might have been subjected to the virus, as after all I was up close and personal with her in that coffee shop, but so far I didn't have any physical symptoms to suggest that I could have caught it, although I had noticed that I was avoiding eating anything rich, as any fatty food brought on feelings of nausea, while my nose-diving appetite had seriously diminished. But I just shrugged my shoulders, putting those absurd, incongruous anomalies down to a change of season and environment. Gretchen had informed me that Cynthia had been placed on a non-fat diet for her liver, was not allowed to drink any alcohol whatsoever, and had also lost a ton of weight from the hepatitis, but she was doing exceedingly well. The doctor had assured her of an excellent full recovery. I continued to watch the rain as I leaned down to stroke the sleeping dog at my feet. Carmiel was a devoted golden retriever that was getting on in years, but he loved lounging around people. Over the last week the two of us had grown very close. "We'll go for a walk just now," I assured him, "once the rain has abated." At the word walk, Carmiel raised his head from his sleeping position to look at me devotedly through brown eager eyes, while his long blonde tail thumped on the floor. It was spring in Colorado, a truly mesmerizing time of the year. I was watching the world before my eyes transform into an artist's palette of pretty spring colours, especially observed in the pink blossoms of the crabapple trees that were illustriously crowned in an ocean of ethereal petals. "Are you coming?" I called out to Carmiel, who raced eagerly towards me, out from under the canopy of the oak table, to make his place firmly at my side. I opened and closed the front door behind me, as I clicked it in the lock, while I placed the key under the doormat. We eagerly ambled towards the woodgrove, that consisted of tall, statuesque ponderosa pines and spruce trees that penciled into the sky like vertical Christmas trees. After the rain, the forest smelt incredible, with the smell of earth mixed with the fragrant infusion of the sweet butterscotch-like scents of the ponderosa pines. The forest floor was strewn with glorious-looking lacy ferns, flowering shrubs, the occasional fallen tree trunk that looked like sculptural benches, swathed in carpets of luxurious, rich, velvety green moss. I could hear the tweets of the birds, observed the occasional squirrel with curious brown eyes darting up a tree trunk. All of a sudden I became dithery, confused, vague, disorientated. The only way I can describe the strange, outlandish feeling is when you've become inebriated, you've lost your mental and physical orientation. It was as if the forest had become like a rocking boat, and I could see that I had lost my stability. Everything was swaying backwards and forwards. Even the trees in the forest became a whirl of colourful dots. I knew something was wrong. What was happening to me? I could feel the sweat breaking out on my forehead, and after that I remembered nothing. I imagine I must have passed out, lost consciousness, collapsed on the forest floor. It felt as if I was locked in some weird dream from which I was trying to awaken, as I drifted in and out of consciousness. I vaguely remember sensing my environment. It seemed strange, but the sight of Carmiel lying by my side, licking my hand, was very reassuring, very comforting. Through my sleeping eyes I opened them slightly to see that I was lying on the scratchy straw inside a homespun-looking shelter made of broken timber and the boughs of a ponderosa pine tree. I could see the familiar needles laced between the trunks that created a large, fragrant canopy over my head that was sheltered from the outside elements, as the floor in this shelter was completely bone dry. I could hear the reassuring pitter-patter of the rain thrashing down outside, but I wasn't uncomfortable by any manner of means, as wrapped up in the cosy confines of this peculiar sheltered nest was strangely snug. Yet I knew I wasn't dreaming. But what on earth was I doing in this bizarre, idiosyncratic place? Where on earth was I? That was when I saw her. I knew at once she was a Bigfoot. Although having lived in Boston all my life, people have put down such anomalous, fictitious creatures as being just stuff of legends. For a university town like Boston, you naturally get those studious academic types, so caught up in their silken, silvery spiderwebs, comprised of the building blocks of intelligent, rational thought and reason, that is so clouded, veiled by their judicious ability to see beyond scientific fact and reason. For these people, the very notion of a Bigfoot existing isn't remotely fathomable. But they were wrong, because the creature that had taken me into this shelter was a Bigfoot without question. With my soaring high temperatures, I was a little delirious, so focusing on her was wrought with its challenges. At first she seemed like a massive fuzzy blur of black hair. But as my eyes acclimatized to this moving, obscure humanoid silhouette that seemed to be fussing around me like a frenzied bee, I could see her shape more clearly. She was tall, imposing, lanky, powerfully built, with overlong arms, a pyramid-shaped head, and a small pair of pert breasts. It was her kind, gentle, feminine face that seized my attention. It was so uncannily human, with a leathery grey skin, deeply furrowed forehead, and deep-set dark brown eyes that seemed intelligent and very earnest. I think it was very significant that Carmia was completely comfortable in her presence, unfazed, undaunted, unintimidated by the creature. On the contrary, as she drifted in and out of the wooded shelter, Carmia seemed to follow her around like a besotted puppy dog. In my sleep I often discerned happy woofs, along with a chattering sound, as if the creature was talking affectionately to the dog, as if in some way they had developed an unlikely attachment together. I think the Bigfoot was bewildered to see my eyes flickering open and focusing directly on her. She came towards me, and I could feel the fragrant smell of mulched ponderosa pine leaves being rubbed on my forehead. They smelt fragrant and were strangely cooling. It felt like a pleasant treatment in a beauty salon. I've since learnt that pine is so good for fevers and inflammation when applied topically. I don't know how long I was with this creature, as sometimes I would feel my lips being saturated by water which she poured into my mouth, or I would taste the rich sweetness of a crushed berry on my tongue, which I would always gratefully swallow. There was a time that 3 shadowy Bigfoot creatures stood around me like 3 burly tree trunks, studying me with concerned expressions on their faces. I remember them having a conversation about me, but it's all so vague, indeterminate, blurred in my memory. I could hear them talking backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, and backwards and forwards in an audible indigenous language, but the voices were muffled, indistinct, and I was caught up in my feverish state, where I drifted in and out of my dreams, only sometimes glancing into reality for a second when my fever plummeted. But despite everything, I just knew I was safe. I could feel those eccentric creatures taking care of me. I remember the largest Bigfoot almost seemed like a medicine man. He placed a stone in my hands which felt cold to the touch, like a rose quartz, along with a necklace of eagle's feathers around my neck. I know that because my hand would touch them and I could feel they were feathers. While all these creatures stood around me, placing their hands on me like a Reiki healing session, I do remember experiencing an idiomatic rush of warm energy pulsing through my body. The following day, after the queer, rather absurd ritual, I was lifted out of my feverish state quite miraculously, glancing down at myself to see that I was covered in a deer pelt. I looked up to see Carmiel by my side, her twinkling, devoted, loving brown eyes focusing on me intently, while her tail wagged profusely, thrashing the ground exuberantly. When she saw I had awoken, she darted out of the timber tent and began to bark excitedly, as if to alert the Bigfoot to my astonishing recovery. As if on cue, the Bigfoot came rushing into the nest, with Carmiel by her side, a set of bright, sparkling brown eyes fixed excitedly upon me. She darted over me to feel my head. I think my fever had subsided because I suddenly felt a whole lot better. I realized I was hungry. Then the Bigfoot brought me some honey and berries, and I began to eat. She said a few words to me that I didn't understand, but I knew they were kind and gentle. I got up and the Bigfoot walked by my side as I made my way back to the ranch, staggering a little uneasily on my feet, but the Bigfoot held me up as I walked. She watched me as I opened the front door with Carmiel by my side. Then she nodded and simply glided away. Imagine my surprise to realize a whole week had gone by where I'd been nursed by a Bigfoot, for when I checked my calendar it had been a Thursday. Now it was the Friday of the following week. It would seem the ranch hands who had left me alone to my own devices had been blindly oblivious to my absence on the ranch. It was clear that Carmiel had been fed by the female Bigfoot, because when I gave her a bowl of kibble, she looked very disheartened, as if to say, "Where is the prime steak?" As for the two fat cats, they were lying across the couch. I noticed carcasses of a few half-eaten mice lying around the place, so they too had managed to take care of themselves while I was indisposed. It was when I discovered that my skin had grown bright yellow, that my urine was the colour of Coca-Cola, that I realised that I did indeed have yellow jaundice, or hepatitis if you like. I'd obviously caught it from my cousin Cynthia at the coffee shop, but even though I was infectious, I was feeling a whole lot better, and was placed in quarantine for a couple of weeks, where I remained in isolation on the ranch. It would seem every time I went for a walk in the woods, Carmiel would start barking loudly. The gentle Bigfoot would reappear. She would come out of the bushes from nowhere, rushing excitedly towards the dog, cradling Carmiel lovingly in her arms, rubbing her face in his coat. I realized that during my sickness, Carmiel and this unlikely creature had certainly formed an incredible bond. The Bigfoot looked at me. Our eyes met. She was so lovely. Her eyes twinkled with pleasure as she studied me. She seemed so happy to see that I was better. She pointed to me and let out a few happy whoops, along with words in a language I didn't understand. I decided that I needed to thank the creature for her extreme kindness towards me, so I ordered some groceries from town, took them into the forest for the Bigfoot in a large box, as I knew this creature had saved my life. For if I'd been lying in the forest unconscious, there is no telling what could have happened to me. I could have been drowned by the rain, attacked by a mountain lion, or eaten by some hungry coyotes. On the day that I'd brought the box of goodies for the Bigfoot in the woods, as I'd expected, Carmiel began to bark and bark to get her attention. And there she was, emerging through the trees, her lofty body, so graceful, so elegant, as she moved towards us as though she was floating. I put the box in front of her, indicated that it was for her. At first she seemed bashful, resistant, shy, reluctant. She moved cautiously towards the box, as if worried that it might actually bite her. She opened it up warily and began to sniff at the different packages, tossing them up in her hand like tennis balls, and then opening some of the cellophane containers, sampling some of the offerings. She pulled out the package of dried fruits, the nuts, the bottles of honey, peanut butter, jelly, cookies, and a vast selection of flavoured popcorns and chips. The creature was so enthused, she began to whoop jubilantly, jumping up and down on her legs like an exuberant puppy dog. She opened the honey and cinnamon popcorn, popping it into her mouth, crunching it happily, and making appreciative, ecstatic ah sounds. And then she picked up the box and glided away. The first day I returned to work at the offices in Boston for Mr. Falconer, it really was unpleasant to be back. Within the first week, the files were once again piling up, and once again I was swamped with work. I returned home, glanced around my flat, and although swathed in exquisite decor, it had lost its lustrous shine. The next day while I was at work, I suddenly decided that I'd had enough. I walked into Mr. Falconer's office, placing the files on his desk. "I can't do this any more," I told him. "I've had enough. I quit." Mr. Falconer looked up at me in astonishment. "I don't understand," he quivered. "You've everything, a top job, an excellent salary. Why would you throw it all away like this?" "Because, Mr. Falconer," I said, "you'll be surprised to know that there are some things in life far more valuable than a hefty pay package. My happiness is worth a hell of a lot more than your pathetic job. I'm glad to inform you that I found a fabulous job working in an art gallery, which I enjoyed so much. Granted, I wasn't being paid the kind of salary as before, so my Jaguar and harbourfront property were gone, but so was the turmoil, the distress of my job. I realised my happiness was so much more valuable than any stuffy job could ever be. As you can imagine, my mother wasn't desperately enamoured by my falling off the pedestal of my so-called prominent, prestigious career. So I had to put up with her hangdog expression for a while, but I certainly didn't care. I never told anyone about the week on a cattle ranch that I'd spent in a Bigfoot's nest. There would be too much, I can assure you, for people to get their heads around here, especially in a university town like Boston that would think such an outrageous claim was nonsensical and ridiculous. I was informed that for 3 weeks after I'd left the ranch, Carmiel kept visiting the woodgrove until she died. No prizes for guessing who she was visiting. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, where is everyone? I asked my 18-year-old girlfriend Patsy, as I stared blankly down the slope of the mountain, looking for any sign of movement ahead of us. A bright flash of red, perhaps, from someone's t-shirt. That's what I would ultimately have expected to have seen. But instead I saw nothing, as the jagged wall of rock blocked my view of the path ahead of us. I had unfortunately been lagging well behind, as a slight fall over a stash of loose stones had thrown me awkwardly off my feet, so that I had inadvertently sprained my ankle rather badly, and was limping. But to be fair, I had assured everyone on the hike that was with me that I'd be as right as rain before long, between gritted teeth, as I was trying my best to be brave, blindly ignoring the shooting spasms of pain in my ankle that refused to abate. I had actively encouraged the hiking group to unwaveringly move ahead along the path, and I would soon catch up with them, as I was sure the pain would dissipate. Our tour guide Mathis had asked me if I was sure I was all right, and I had promptly insisted I would be absolutely fine. Now I was not so sure, as the pain in my ankle was excruciating, so much so that I bit my lip, so that I could drag my mind away from the throbbing in my ankle to the coppery taste of blood on my tongue, as a better distraction, but it certainly failed to work, as the agonizing pain appeared to be relentless. I was hobbling along the billowing path like a decrepit old man, wincing with pain every time I reluctantly attempted to put weight on my foot. I crawled very gingerly over the undulating terrain that swelled with jagged rocks and patches of grass that peered through little crevices and creeks, as occasionally the alpine flowers would peek through the ground, showering the footpath in a pretty scattering of pink. It was a prepossessing, blissfully beautiful day for a hike. The weather was pretty close to perfect, and not too hot sunshine shone warmly on our shoulders and backs, and after a cold, rather bleak winter, the sunshine was gladly appreciated to everyone in our group, who was happy to embrace the promise of summer again. The sky was a cup of perfect blue, without a fluffy cotton wool cloud in sight, and soaring above our heads, a couple of distinguished-looking golden eagles, with outstretched wings, were magisterially riding the wind current like skilled surfers on the waves. I craned my neck to watch these mesmerizing aerial performances, and in that split second the stones beneath my feet slid forward. I lost my balance precariously, and went crashing to the ground, as if I'd been hit by a bullet, my left foot getting tangled up in some thorny shrubs, so that my ankle was twisted at an odd angle, which meant it was a miracle it hadn't actually broken. It would seem our hiking group had charged ahead of us, leaving me and my girlfriend Patsy far behind them. Perhaps they'd forgotten about us, and were focused on getting back to camp, as everyone was hungry and tired from the long trek through the wooded valley and up the mountain slope. Patsy, my girlfriend, looked heartily annoyed. Her face seemed to lose its prettiness when she became mad. She let out a sizable frown. "People can be so damned selfish," she said. "They knew you sprained your ankle, yet they parsimoniously charge off ahead of us like this. It's insane. We're supposed to stick together as a group. But no, they all decide to hoggishly barge ahead of us, leaving us far behind them. How egocentrically selfish can you get? This is insanely ridiculous. I'm sorry, but that guy Mathis is not a good guide. He should be responsible for the whole group and look out for all of us. But I can see that that is just too much to ask." "Don't worry," I said. "I have slowed down everyone significantly after spraining my ankle.
You can't blame them for marching ahead like that. Everyone is tired and hungry. It's easy to lose focus. I might have done the same in their shoes. There's nothing worse than one person slowing down the entire party, especially when everyone's eager to get back to camp. It's been a long afternoon, and everyone is understandably fatigued, if not a little grumpy because they're hangry. It happens. Don't be mad at them.
How can you say that, Jaden? Honestly, that's why people hike together. We're supposed to look out for each other. Imagine, for example, climbing Mount Everest and promptly abandoning half your party. You stick together, don't you? It's a code of ethics, is it not? And no one in this group knows the meaning of that. It's disgusting. I listened to see if I could hear the voices of our group ahead of us, but the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, carrying our fellow hikers further away from us. There was no sign or sighting of the hikers anywhere, but at the painstakingly slow pace I was going in, it would seem there was no way me and my girlfriend Patsy would be able to catch up with them at this rate, which was more than a little frustrating. Patsy was impatiently tetchy at the best of times, and was exceedingly exasperated. My sprained ankle was refusing to get any better, and I knew my walking was dramatically impeded. By the time I finally got back to camp, it would soon be getting dark. I was moving at an unenviable snail's pace, and would potentially have to crawl back to camp if needs must, flinching in pain all the way there. Patsy placed her hands rather defiantly on her hips, unable to disguise the peevish annoyance that blistered her face in a series of prominent frown lines. "It's so bloody typical, isn't it?" she ranted angrily. "Excuse the bad language, Jaden, but I can't help myself. I'm really pissed. What's wrong with those people barging ahead of us like this, without so much as a bye or leave, not bothering to exhibit any common courtesy whatsoever? It might do them well to learn some civility." Patsy paused for a long moment, seeming to think long and hard about what to do about our circumstances. And then she said assertively, "I better leave you here, Jaden, and go on the footpath ahead to catch up with the others, to tell them that you need proper help. I don't think you can possibly walk on that retarded ankle of yours. You're going to need help." Patsy removed her floppy sun hat from her head, as if such an action would make her think more clearer. She then replaced it over her auburn shoulder-length hair. "I'd never have come on this hike if I knew we'd be hanging around such self-centered people like this," she said grimly. "They're supposed to be friends of your cousin Lisa's. My foot! If these are friends, who needs enemies?" she said sarcastically, her lips twitching with affronted indignation.
"You're being unfair," I told her. "I don't think you would feel this way about them if I hadn't taken an unfortunate tumble over those loose stones. I think everyone in the group got distracted. For all you know, they probably think I'm walking with them now, and that they have no clue that they've left us far behind them. They probably think we're around the very next bend. There's so many twists and turns on this trail."
My girlfriend frowned. "You're too nice about people, Jaden. That's your problem. Always believing the best in people and giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm much more cynical than you, I'm afraid. I don't have much faith in human nature. I've been let down too many times by too many people, and I'm sorry, but your cousin's friends are a little eccentric, to say the very least. And if they haven't noticed we're not with them, then they really aren't paying any attention. That sucks big time. As far as I'm concerned, you should always be vigilant when you're on a hike of any kind, checking that everyone is in the party with you. But no, that's too much to ask, isn't it?"
"It'll be better in a moment. My ankle, I mean," I assured my girlfriend. "Just give it a second or so."
Patsy's face was shrouded in doubt, as I hobbled precariously behind her, wincing in pain, trying my best to soothe her inflamed infuriation, but it was not working. My girlfriend looked like she wanted to punch someone in the face. She appeared mad. I wondered if bringing her along on this 3-day hike had been a good idea after all. I noticed her skin had grown red, and she was strutting forward, kicking the footpath like an angry elephant, even though she was a little on the skinny side. Soon, with a great deal of a struggle on my part, we managed to approach the crest of the slope.
Look, I'm sure I'm going to be all right, I assured her. Give me a little more time for the pain to settle down, would you? I practically begged her, but my girlfriend refused to listen.
Are you kidding me, Jaden? What are you smoking? I don't think your ankle is going to get better in a hurry. You know it, and I know it. Your face is contorted in pain. I can see you wincing every time you put weight on your foot. You're trying to hide it well from me, but I'm no idiot. You had a bad fall. I saw how you twisted that foot of yours when you got caught up in that shrub. You're not moving any faster, and if you think you're going to get moving, you're deluding yourself. The pain is not going to just magically disappear like that. I've got news for you. It's your body telling you not to walk on that leg, and you need to listen to the pain. It's there for a reason. I'm going to go and get help. You stay here. I need to catch up with the others, and when I do, I'm going to rain fire, hell, and damnation on them all. And by the time I'm finished with them, they'll wish that they've never been born.
Don't be too hard on them, Patsy, I warned her. Try and be nice, will you? Don't make a big deal out of this.
I hasten to say my girlfriend's desire to get help for me was reassuring, and I felt a huge sense of relief wash over me, like a soothing rain shower. I knew in my heart that I couldn't get any further on this foot of mine, so I reluctantly sat down on the hilly slope of the shingly footpath and nodded to her.
I guess you're right. I don't think this ankle of mine is going to get better quickly. I think I've done more damage to it than I care to admit. It's just so damn inconvenient, isn't it? I'm sorry to be such a wet blanket and to ruin this hike for you. But you're right. There is no way I can go any further on this ankle of mine. It's such a bummer, but it is what it is, I suppose. If I had not been craning my neck to watch those spectacular golden eagles soaring in the heavens above, none of this would have happened. And such sightings are more common in winter, where the birds feed on salmon and animal carcasses. So it was too good to be true to see them.
Don't talk like that, Jaden. If only I had done this, or if only I had done that. It's all ineffectual chatter. It's impotent, a complete waste of time. I personally wouldn't have missed watching those golden eagles soaring in the skies above us for all the tea in China. It's unfortunate that you lost your footing. But let's not kid. Some of those stones on the footpath are far too loose and can drag you forwards if you're not paying attention. I nearly slipped on numerous occasions myself. They should warn people about the footpath. It's precarious, to say the very least. And by the way, you can't possibly just sit over there where you're sitting now, she said, watching me, as I sat on the stones on the footpath. I mean, if it gets any hotter, you might bake in the sun. Even though it doesn't feel particularly hot now, it might intensify later on. We can't take that risk, even though it's late afternoon. I'll take you over to that cluster of the trees over there. You can lean on me and sit in the shade under that verdant spray of foliage, which will keep you camouflaged and cool. I'll go and get help for you. How will that suit you? I nodded in defeated resignation. I leaned on my girlfriend's shoulders and, putting my weight on her like a crutch, hobbled over to a large collection of trees clustered together tightly in the valley, magnanimously offering a resplendent shade with their outstretched leafy boughs. I knew a rambunctious stream threaded through those trees in the lower dip in the valley, and I could distinctly hear the distant gurgle of water crashing obstreperously against the rocks. The sound was soothing and oddly comforting. "Are you sure you're going to be all right here?" my girlfriend asked me clemently. "I'm worried about leaving you on your own, Jaden, when you can barely walk on that foot of yours. It's that bloody hiking group. They're to blame. I mean, honestly, this is all their damn fault. None of this would have happened if they were paying attention."
"Of course I'll be fine," I said airily.
Patsy removed my backpack from her back, that she had confiscated from me earlier during my fall. She opened it up to pull out a bottle of water, which she handed over to me. "Here, you better drink this. You don't want to become dehydrated. The last thing I need is you fainting on me, because I don't know how long it will be when I finally come back for you. I suspect that good old Mattis will pick up the Range Rover, and he'll bring you back." I took the bottle of water from her gratefully, realizing that I was surprisingly thirsty, my throat dry and parched. because I could not remember when I'd last taken a drink. "Right, I'll be off now," said Patsy temperately, replacing the backpack on her back. "I'm sure I won't be terribly long. I can move like a March hare if I really want to. I'll quickly catch up with the others. They're probably not too far away from camp now." I watched my girlfriend doggedly pick up her pace, swinging her arms and legs furiously, as she indomitantly, with a bull-headed grit and methodical determination, mulishly trotted down the mountain slope. Her purposeful stride suggested rather ominously that she was going to give the hikers that had marched ahead of us hell when she finally met up with them. Boy, I was glad not to be wearing their hiking boots, as you didn't want to get on the wrong side of my girlfriend, or there'd be hell to pay. I knew Patsy could have a temper on her that was not for the faint-hearted. Some said it was the fire in her hair that predisposed her to being very feisty, but I'd always been attracted to her spirited personality. But when her temper would flare up, I always liked to give her distance. Soon she was all but a speck in the distance, like a little black carpenter ant, and I was struck in that moment how tiny I was, surrounded by the domineeringly rugged configurations and features of Mother Nature herself, that made us all, in the grand scheme of things, so inconspicuously small by contrast. It was strange to be alone, sheltering under the shade of a tree, listening to the pretty sounds of tweets, warbles, and whistles of the bird-song in the branches above my head. It was oddly peaceful being left on my own, swaddled by the graceful protective natural world on every side. My ankle began to throb violently. I circumspectly removed my sweaty sock and my walking boot to examine my injury more closely, as until now I had not really inspected it, and not really gleaned what I'd done to myself, even though I knew unequivocally, of course, that I hadn't broken a bone. I was surprised to see the area round my ankle was rudely swollen, with a huge bulging area of distended, rather unsightly blue and purple bruising, the colour of a thunderous sky, and it was beginning to form obtrusively on my skin, which fascinated me to observe, as I didn't bruise easily, so it was like studying a great work of contemporary art, where the artist had flung very foreboding purple and black colours on the canvas. The bruise was substantial in size, swollen and tender to the touch, so even a finger on the skin made me wince out in pain. I had really done a number on myself, I thought. I hugged my knees close to my chest and made myself as comfortable as I could, using the trunk of the tree as an upholstered support for my back, which was also beginning to ache. My cousin Lisa and her bird-loving friends had chosen to come to this private lodge in Washington, not too far from Mount Spokane State Park, for a 3-day camping trip, and it had been a wonderful experience up until now. We had set off at the crack of dawn early in the morning, and had spotted a great deal of indigenous wildlife and some spectacular birds along the way, like the Anas hummingbird, red-winged blackbird, and a selection of warblers. My cousin Lisa had come on this trip solely because of the birds, as her group of friends were bird enthusiasts and travelled all around North America on the lookout for rare specimens of birds. It was for this reason we were at this lodge, as many rare species of birds had been reported in this location. Every evening around the fire pit, outside our pitched tents, my cousin's friends had talked tirelessly about nothing else but birds, and I had wondered what all the fuss was about, until I myself had observed so many spectacular species of bird. You could say I'd almost caught the infectious bug myself. My girlfriend had not particularly warmed to Cousin Lisa's friends. She thought that there were other things people could talk about besides birds, but when she tried to change the conversation, it would abruptly veer back to our feathery friends, and that began to annoy my girlfriend incessantly, who was constantly harping on at me. "Why can't we talk about something else for a change? Your cousin's friends are preoccupied and infatuated by birds. What on earth is wrong with them? There are other things in life, you know, beyond just birds."
"It's called being passionate," I told her. "Nothing wrong with being impassionate and zealous about something. It's what makes our lives worth living."
"If you say so," said my girlfriend. I was privately wondering how long it would take before Patsy finally got help for me, as I was hankering to hear the sound of the tour guide's purple Range Rover Defender
roaring across the stony path. The afternoon that had stretched before us like a sizable yawn had been long, arduous and tiring. I felt a little fatigued, although thankfully it hadn't been terribly hot. I could feel my stomach gurgling, retching and groaning with hunger. It had been a long time since I'd last eaten. I was aching to get back to the camp, and to fill my empty belly, pop a few painkillers, and put my feet up. We had been on our feet since the crack of dawn, and I was worn out and weary, and extremely frustrated and aggrieved about my ankle letting the side down. Still, it couldn't be helped, could it? And dwelling on it would make me all the more miserable, so I needed to focus my attention somewhere else. I knew Patsy was quite athletic, so it wouldn't be long before she caught up with the others. The trouble is, there were times her mouth should have been washed out with soap and water, as the thorny barbs that would come out of her at times really should have been neutered. To look at, my girlfriend looked so sweet. You'd never believe she was capable of such outrageous indignance. But when she grew angry, she was like an untamed fire, impossible to put out, and some of the littlest things could set her off in a tangent. But underneath it all, I knew she had a good heart, and was one of the kindest people you could hope to meet. My mother didn't like her at all, as she was blunt and in your face, and not afraid to randomly throw out swear words, which my mother found offensive. She was forever telling my girlfriend, "There's no need to swear like a sailor in our home, or to have a mouth like a potty, as it's unbecoming for a young lady. I would prefer it, Patsy, if you didn't swear in front of my children," she had said time and time again, always telling my younger siblings to block their ears if my girlfriend used bad words in front of them. I remember a prime example of my girlfriend's scornful behaviour happened one night over dinner at our house in Spokane, Washington. My little brother began to stick out his tongue at my mother because he didn't want to eat the carrots on his dinner plate, and was having a little hissy fit, slamming his fists on the table. "I'm not going to eat the carrots, 'cause I hate them," he said with an outrageous indignance. "If you don't eat your carrots, love, there'll be no ice cream," my mother had told him firmly. My brother promptly stuck out his tongue at my mother and said, "I hate you, Mummy. You're the worst mummy in the entire world. My friend Tommy doesn't have to eat carrots, but you're mean." "Well then, little Tommy is not going to grow up big and strong, is he? Because he doesn't eat his carrots. Boys that don't eat carrots don't grow big," my mother had said obsequiously. My brother's hostility to eating his carrots set my girlfriend off. She threw a wobbly. "Don't stick out your tongue at your mother like that, you spoilt little brat," she shrieked unabashedly at my brother. "There's starving kids in Africa that would be grateful for those carrots, you know." "I don't care about that," said my brother. "You can send the carrots to them in the post if you like," he said sarcastically, pushing his plate over to my girlfriend, as if half expecting her to place them in an airtight envelope with an African address on the front. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" said my girlfriend. "Got an answer for everything, have you?" My mother had not appreciated my girlfriend interfering with her disciplining of my little brother, and I could see she was aggrieved by Patsy's determination to nip my brother's bad behaviour in the bud. That was Patsy for you, not afraid to express her opinion on anything, even if she chose to cause offence in the process. Maybe it was the quintessential reason I was attracted to her in the first place. She wasn't afraid to be controversial and to speak her mind, and I admired her for that, but my mother clearly did not. "Why can't you go out with a nice girl, Jaden?" she would tell me over and over again. "That girlfriend of yours has a mouth on her like a sewer. You really know how to pick them, love." "Mum, she's just passionate about things, that's all. I'd sooner have a passionate girlfriend who has my back and cares about me, rather than an insouciant, impassive girlfriend who says all the right things, even if she doesn't actually mean them. Whatever you might think about Patsy, she's loyal and dependable, and that's a big deal to me." "Her crude tongue is the problem, love," said my mother. "There's some things you don't articulate to keep the peace, but your girlfriend crosses those social boundaries. I'm sorry, but she does." As I was comfortably sitting back under the cooling branches of the tree that dappled my face in a pleasing, rather agreeable shade, I reflected on my girlfriend's reactions to the hiking party, when she finally did catch up with them. I could see her standing there in my mind's eye, with angry hands on her hips, glaring at them furiously, and saying to them in a condescending tone of voice, "I hope you lot are proud of yourselves, sauntering off in the way you did. You left us far behind. Jaden can't walk any further. He needs help. Did you even stop to consider his condition after he had that nasty fall? No, of course you didn't. It might interest you to know he's had a great deal of pain on that ankle of his. He can't put any weight on it, so it's impossible for him to walk. I hope you lot are proud of yourselves." All of a sudden, my lingering on how Patsy would react when she caught up with her fellow hikers was promptly distracted by what I can only describe as what sounded like a dog shaking his coat after a swim. I knew the sound well. We had 2 shaggy dogs back at home that were always diving ebulliently into the water to retrieve sticks, and shaking their coats after they'd been in the water was common. In a trice, a wet spray seemed to be landing on my body, sprinkling me with droplets of water through the trees, as if I'd walked past a garden hose. I knew I was sitting further away from the stream, on a higher elevation on the hillside. So where had the mysterious droplets of water come from, I wondered? There had been no rain in the area recently, and the leaves on the branches were very dry. And that was when I noticed through the billowing branches of the trees, sprinkled heavily with pale green leaves, what I discerned was a lofty, somewhat shadowy, tenebrific silhouette that appeared to be shaking its body rather vigorously, like a quaking aspen tree. My first natural thought that flew into my head was, what the hell is that? I scrunched up my eyes in the hope that such a focused ocular manoeuvre would make me see this thing more clearly, as the overhanging leafy curtain of foliage across my face appeared to block out most of my view, and made everything I observed somewhat vague and obscure. I knew it wasn't a bear that I was seeing, although this Herculean-sized thing was covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair. Ostensibly, this thing possessed the distinctive stature of a man, and was far bigger and more powerful than a black bear. It was standing upright on 2 legs, with overlong arms that trailed well below the knee area, and the body was densely muscular. The hair that was clinging to the body was soaking wet, exactly like that of a shaggy dog. I knew at once that this thing must have taken a dip in the stream in the lower valley, and climbed up the hill to shake out its coat, not far from where I was sitting, which was why some of the water droplets had been fired at me indiscriminately, unbeknown to this creature, who seemed to be able to shake out its coat over a large expansive area, and by the looks of things, there was a lot of water locked up in that hair of his. In a trice, I found myself looking at the distinctive, undeniable profile of the creature up closer, and that was when I knew that I was looking at a Bigfoot. I think I threw my hands over my mouth, gasping in astonishment. I don't mind admitting that encountering a Bigfoot is the last thing I would envisage happening to me, but there he was, standing there larger than life, and the reality of what I was seeing slapped all my doubts about the creature's existence hard in the face. It was a rude wake-up call for me, realizing in a stunned horror that these cryptic creatures actually exist here in North America, something I stubbornly was resistant about believing for a long time, owing to having quite a scientific mindset and being taught by teachers in the past, close-minded to anything that could not be proved. So their indelible, well-meaning influences on my life had been dramatic. I was now staring at this creature with such confoundment, feeling certain that I had to be dreaming. It couldn't be real, could it? I closed my eyes for a second time, and slowly but surely, rather reluctantly, opened them again. I was certain the creature would be gone, and then I could deny to myself that I'd seen it at all, because somehow lying to myself about what I'd seen was so much easier than accepting the cold hard truth. The creature stood there staring at me, without so much as saying a word, and as funny as this may sound, I got a profound sense he was reading my thoughts, and was beginning to enjoy rubbing his presence in my face, so that I could not deny his existence. It was almost like he was saying to me, "There you are. I'm real. Get over it."
I could see the rise and fall of its chest as the creature breathed, but the expression on his face told me little of what he was actually thinking. I do, however, believe I caught him off guard. He had not expected to see me, and was not certain about how to react to my presence. But seeing him up close and personal, only yards away from where I was sitting under the tree, I knew at once he was non-aggressive. I guess his eyes were the big giveaway. People say the eyes are the windows of the soul, and they're absolutely right about that. I've heard stories of people encountering evil people in horrific crime scenarios, and the first thing they'll say to you is the eyes of the killer were vacuously dark and empty, as if the perpetrator himself had absolutely no soul. The reverse could be said about this Bigfoot, as his lively treacle-coloured eyes were spirited, amused even, and full of spirited life. But there was also kind tenderness in those eyes, that almost at once my booming heartbeat grew as calm as a peaceful sea on a clear day. My fast breathing slowed down significantly. I knew that this Bigfoot would never ever hurt me, and whether he communicated that with me, I am not certain. But I felt safer with the Bigfoot being around than in my former position of sitting under the tree by myself, entirely alone. I felt protected and safe, almost as if nothing could ever hurt me, with the Bigfoot watching over me. Why I felt this way I don't know, but the feeling was inexplicably profound. I knew the creature was male, even though his anatomy was well hidden from view, owing to his long flowing hair, which was thick and dense. But his chest and shoulders were impressively broad, with no sign of any breast tissue. But the big giveaway for me was his male energy. He was a powerful creature, and even among his own kind, I suspected he demanded respect wherever he went. He had that leadership quality about him that reminded me of an Indian chief who leads and directs the way of his followers. I felt shame in my heart when I remembered a while ago, during my school days, ridiculing a friend of mine, Chuck Warrington, who had told me he had had a Bigfoot encounter once. I knew he lived in a rural farmhouse somewhere on the outskirts of Spokane, which I believe was not too far away from where we were hiking. The encounter had happened when he was 10 years old. I claimed, of course, that he was making it up to get attention for himself. I'd always known Chuck to be the type of young boy that wanted to be the centre of attention in all things. He would randomly throw wet tissue paper across the classroom floor, stick mean, spiteful notes on people's backs, telling others to please kick me, which he found hilariously funny. He was one of those annoying pupils the teachers loved to hate, and always asked to stand in the corner of the classroom for misbehaving inappropriately. He seemed to delight in the attention he received from angry teachers, even if he was being reprimanded. I remember on one occasion he put a harmless grass snake in a teacher's purse to scare the bejesus out of her, and delighted when she let out a terrified scream when the snake promptly slithered out of her purse onto the classroom desk. She dropped the purse on the floor, running out of the classroom screaming in terror, as Mrs. von Velden was terrified of snakes. So when Chuck Warrington promptly told me he'd seen a Bigfoot, I took it, as I did with all things when it concerned him, with a pinch of salt. I do remember his twin sister, who went to an all-girls school and was the same age as him, had warned me never to believe a word her brother spouted.
"He can't help himself," she told me. "He always wants to be the centre of attention, and he'll say and do anything to get it."
When Chuck told me he'd seen a Bigfoot, I guess he expected me to believe him, but I didn't.
"Really?"
I said sarcastically.
"Where did you see it then?"
I remember he'd been visibly upset. He actually burst into tears, which was most unlike him, and asked me why I wouldn't believe him. I told him it was because he always wanted attention. The truth was, if I'm being fiercely honest, there was something about my friend's demeanour that day that told me in no uncertain terms that maybe, just maybe, he was actually telling me the truth. But I refused to give him the benefit of the doubt.
"Go on," I said. "Where did you see it? Or has the cat got your tongue?" "Why are you being so mean?"
he scolded me.
"I'm not going to tell you if you don't believe me. You can ask my sister if you like. She'll tell you that I'm not making it up.
She saw it too. And you know my sister, she doesn't tell lies.
I shrugged my shoulders to walk away. I really believed that my friend was seeking attention, and saying he'd seen a Bigfoot was the kind of thing he would do to get it. Why would I trust a word he had to say? And as for asking his sister about the experience, regretfully, I never did.
Well, I'm going to tell you what happened, even if you don't believe me. I was playing in the woods with my sister. We were climbing trees in the grove. We heard something grunting. We knew someone was coming. We thought it was the old man my dad hires, that looks after our horses. So we hid because he's got a really bad temper. He hates children, you see. He's always telling us to get out of his way. We knew he wouldn't be amused to see us ferreting around in the trees, so we remained very still. The grunting got closer and closer, and that was when we saw the Bigfoot. We couldn't believe it was so big, but it looked just like a human being, covered in hair. We were scared it was going to see us, but if it knew we were there, it didn't do anything about it. It just glided away and was gone. We were so relieved, because it was very scary, he said, demonstrating to me with hand gestures how big the Bigfoot had actually been, which I thought at the time was highly exaggerated. But now, having seen the Bigfoot that I was seeing now, I knew differently. Me and my sister knew we'd seen a Bigfoot, he told me earnestly. But we told our parents, like I'm telling you now, and they didn't believe a word of it. Mum says such creatures don't exist, but we know what we saw, and we're not making it up, he had told me insistently. You know what, Chuck, I said, walking away. You know you're making this up, and like your parents, I don't believe a word of it either. I felt remarkable shame as I remembered the unkind words I had directed towards Chuck Warrington. Now I had egg on my face, as through the branches of the trees I could see the Bigfoot clearly. I was half expecting the Bigfoot to turn away, as it had done in the case of Chuck and his sister, but no such luck. On the contrary, the Bigfoot pulled back the branches of the trees, squattering under the branches, moving slowly towards me on his haunches, so that I could have reached out to touch him if I'd wanted to. The Bigfoot's eyes dropped to my foot and my displaced boot, along with my smelly sock. Before I knew it, the large hand of the Bigfoot, with his sausage-sized fingers, was on my ankle, examining it. The creature whistled in astonishment as it studied the bruising. It seemed to appreciate that I couldn't walk on my foot, and I think he believed I needed help, and that I was stuck under the tree indefinitely, incapable of going anywhere, which of course was actually true. Imagine my abject amazement when the Bigfoot spoke to me, in my head of course. "It hurts?" he asked me questioningly. "You cannot walk on it? Is that why you are sitting here under this tree, on your own, far away from your camp? People here camp out here all the time, when the weather is good. Lots of visitors come here." The Bigfoot did not speak like you or I might when we engage in a conversation, although I suspect he could. This communication was done completely telepathically. "I can see you need my help. How else are you going to get back to your camp? Your friends and family will be likely worrying about you, wondering where you are." The Bigfoot asked me to look into his eyes, as he'd help me get back to safety. I was about to argue with him, to tell him not to worry about me, that help was surely being sent my way. But the Bigfoot began to point to his eyes, and yes, I admit, I was compelled to look right into them. And after that, I remember nothing at all, which is the strangest thing about this whole experience. It was almost like my mind went completely blank, as if lights out went on in my head, and for years I wondered what had actually happened there. The next thing I know, it was a late afternoon, bleeding into the early evening. I found myself waking up in one of the tents on our camping site, but I reasoned that I hadn't been asleep for very long. How I knew this, I couldn't be sure. I was not in the tent that belonged to me, that I was sharing with my girlfriend. Instead, I was in a tent that my cousin Lisa occupied, that she shared with her best friend Eva. I could see a pile of bird books stashed to one side of Eva's sleeping bag that I happened to be sitting on. There was also a sketch pad where the woman had drawn some spectacular pictures of birds. The one she'd done of a hummingbird was absolutely superb. I had no idea she was such an excellent artist. She'd certainly kept her light under a bushel. I sat up with a start, feeling marginally disorientated, wondering how I got into the tent in the first place. I was sure Eva would not be remotely amused to see that I was actually lying on top of her sleeping bag. But how had I got here? It was then that a memory flashed back in my head, and I remembered looking into a Bigfoot's eyes. I realized he must have brought me to the camp and placed me in Eva's tent. Yet I had no memory of the experience. At this point in time, the camp appeared to be very quiet, with not a solitary soul in sight. I wondered if the Bigfoot had put me in some kind of a trance-like state. That would be the only explanation, because how could I explain getting here without any memory of the experience? It must have been about 10 minutes later, when I could hear voices at the campsite. I realized the hiking group had returned, but how had I got back to the camp quicker than they had? I could hear my girlfriend arguing with some of the hikers, and she sounded far from amused and completely out of breath, as if she'd been running all the way to catch up with the rest of the group. She was speaking in desperate gasps. I physically squirmed as she unleashed her wrath on everyone, without apology. I marvelled at the fact that on my sprained ankle, the Bigfoot had outrun them all on this trail, when in the beginning he had been a long way behind all the hikers. And this was something I privately marvelled.
"No, of course I wasn't with you," came my girlfriend's barreling voice. "Did you not check to see that me and Jaden were not there? How could you be so selfish? Do you not know we're supposed to stick together as a team? If you must know, Jaden took a nasty tumble. Well, you saw it yourself, didn't you? He hurt his ankle really badly. He couldn't put weight on his foot. He's a long way back on the trail, waiting for help under a tree, as you left us both behind. How could you do that? You people should be ashamed of yourselves." "I'm very sorry," came Mathis, the tour guide's voice. He could be heard mumbling apologetically. "I thought we were all together. I had no idea you were far behind us. Jaden told us that he would be absolutely fine. I'm afraid I took him at his word. If the truth be told, I didn't think his sprain was all that bad. I thought he'd just slipped over some loose stones. We genuinely thought you were around the very next corner, lagging behind us, that's all. We had no idea how far back you actually were. The trail was very windy."
"Is that all you can say? You knew Jaden had sprained his ankle. Don't pretend you didn't. And that wasn't just a light fall. Didn't it cross your mind to check up on us, to see if in fact we were actually behind us, as you presumed?"
"Jaden said he was going to be all right, that he'd catch up with us," came Mattis's defeated voice. "I genuinely thought he meant it."
"That's because he was being brave and considerate towards you. He didn't want to hold everybody up, but it doesn't mean he was actually all right."
"I'm very sorry, ma'am. Very sorry. You're right. I should have checked up on him. I will go and pick him up right away."
"I should hope so. You should be ashamed of yourself, Mathis. You call yourself a tour guide, and yet you don't take care of your responsibilities, and we are your responsibilities." My cousin Lisa was trying to calm down my inflamed girlfriend. "Look, Patsy, you heard Mathis. He's sorry, all right. We genuinely all thought you guys were behind us. We were exhausted and hungry. We got distracted. We saw a very unusual bird on the trail, a male white-headed woodpecker, which is incredibly rare. And the other day we saw the western ground parrot, another rare sighting. And this was very special, so we talked about it all the way back. I guess we didn't think about you And for that we're profoundly sorry. But it really wasn't personal. The problem with you lot is all you ever talk about is birds, birds and more birds. And are there any other things in the world beyond our feathery friends that you are interested in? Probably not. It might have been nice to actually be graced with your attention once in a while, if you'd dare to have given us a passing thought. I know you don't share our passion for birds, Patsy, but there's no need to be so condescending. Now, don't you think we better get into the Range Rover to go and pick up Jaden, rather than just standing here arguing between ourselves? It'll be dark soon. We better be on our way. I realised that everyone would be unduly alarmed if my girlfriend was finally to discover that I was not where I'd been left, so I needed to get everyone's attention swiftly. I awkwardly staggered to my feet, with an agonising spasm of pain shooting through my foot, and with an ungainly, unsteady wobble, I hobbled awkwardly out of the tent, so that a couple of people that had returned to camp would surely see me, and when they did, they quickly called out to Mathis, the tour guide, and to my girlfriend Patsy, to get their prompt attention. "Don't worry about going after Jaden. He's already here. He returned to camp before us." The next thing I knew was all the hikers were gathered around me, confounded, as they looked down at my one bare foot that was puffed up, swollen, and very inflamed, and one glance at it would make you unequivocally aware that I could not possibly walk on it. I had left my hiking boot and sock under the tree, and I guess they remained there, a reminder of my nasty fall. I had arrived back at the camp long before the others had, and they couldn't make sense of this conundrum. "I don't understand this," said my girlfriend, looking astounded. "How is it possible that you got here ahead of us, on that foot of yours? You could barely walk. This isn't possible. Where on earth is your boot? And why are you only wearing one boot? And why is your other foot bare?" I knew better not to tell them that I suspected a Bigfoot must have brought me back to camp, as such a revelation would have been met with great scepticism. But I was in no doubt that this is what had happened. "I don't know how I got here. I can't remember," I lied. I figured out the words "I can't remember" would cover over a multitude of sins. "But you couldn't walk on your ankle," protested my girlfriend. "How could you get here before everybody else? I ran the whole way to catch up with the group. Can't you see I'm out of breath? And you look as if you've just had a hot bath. Your foot is hugely swollen. You couldn't walk on it. This is paradoxical, to say the very least." I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly and said, "I can't remember," again. So everyone's conversation reverted from talking about birds to wondering how on earth it was physically possible for me to get to the camp ahead of everyone else on a sprained ankle. Everyone had their ambitious, far-fetched theories, but no one knew what had really happened to me. But I did in the end tell my girlfriend the truth, when she practically milked it out of me. "You're kidding," she said. "You think a Bigfoot carried you to the campsite, yet you have no memory of your journey back to the tent? That's insane." "I know it is, isn't it? The last thing I remember is looking into the Bigfoot's eyes. Maybe it put me into some kind of trance. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. It was like being anaesthetized from an anesthetic. I woke up rather dazed and confused, wondering if what had happened had really occurred, or if it had been a dream. But I assure you, it did." "I don't know what to say," said my girlfriend. "That's incredible. But of course it happened. There is no physical way you could have possibly walked to the camp on that foot of yours. You had to have help, and you got it in the most unorthodox of ways." 12 years later, the estate agent, a man called Peter Foldforth, seemed rather nervous as he showed me and my now wife Patsy, the disagreeable young lady who'd been with me on that hike with my cousin Lisa and a group of her bird-fanatic friends years before. He was showing us around a spectacular-looking property that quite literally took my breath away. It must have been around the third house of the morning that we'd physically been escorted around, and we had seen many more other houses over recent weeks, and the whole house-hunting malarkey had become ludicrously time-consuming and very unsatisfactory. Regretfully, the previous 2 houses we'd been shown around that morning did nothing to inspire us. They were pretty nondescript. Me and my wife were looking for a house with notable character and charm, even if it did require some TLC to knock it back into shape, as neither of us were intimidated by hard work of any kind. I was lucky. I had a reasonable budget to spend, thanks to having made a huge profit on one of my investments that came through for me unexpectedly. So we had money to buy something halfway decent. I had married the young controversial woman that my mother did not desperately like. But over the last few years my mother had managed to warm to Patsy a wee little bit, when she realised it didn't do to be arch rivals with her daughter-in-law, as it certainly would not bode well for the future of her potential relationship with her still-to-be-born grandchildren. I hasten to say that although my wife still fiercely wore her heart on her sleeve, it would seem some of her bad language she had employed in the past to get her feelings across had mellowed and tamed down significantly, which was a relief. But even so, my wife was not afraid to be ruthlessly blunt at times, so she was, in fact, a work in progress. Mr. Foldforth, the estate agent, was impeccably dressed, sporting a rather debonair, well-cut pinstripe suit and a pair of shiny black leather shoes that were so polished I could almost see my face reflected in the leather. He was cleanly shaven, but wore a well-manicured little moustache on his face. He was clearly proud of his manscaping. I was sure he was the kind of man that removed every last hair on his body. He wore a pair of zooty glasses that did not come cheap, and stylishly framed his steely grey eyes, giving him a trendy appearance. There was no doubt that he was new to the game, and I doubted he had sold a house to a client before a single day in his life. He gave off that aura of inexperience and uncertainty. I observed he was shaking nervously in his boots, while his colleague, who was sitting in the driver's side seat of the white BMW that they'd come in together, I suspect, as a team, appeared to be earnestly watching our engagement with Mr. Foldforth from a distance, rather like when you're taking a driving test and are privately being examined by a driving instructor. I guessed that Mr. Peter Foldforth, who was dealing with us, was between the ages of 20, possibly even 30, but I doubted that. I noticed the man in the car was probably in his early 40s. He was equally as well groomed and turned out as Mr. Foldforth himself. He kept nodding at Mr. Foldforth encouragingly whenever our estate agent looked up in the direction of the white BMW for prompting, rather like someone who'd forgotten their lines on stage and needed a little help to urge them along. It was as if the estate agent sitting in the car was telling Mr. Foldforth in a silent telepathic exchange, "You're doing well. Keep it together, and whatever you do, don't blow the sale. I'm banking on you to get it right." It did not take a rocket scientist not to realize that our realtor had been thrown into the deep end by the real estate company. Poor Mr. Foldforth was trying his level best to please our every demand, and apprehensive about putting a foot out of alignment, which made me feel marginally sympathetic towards his plight. I knew from my own experience that being new to any job could be intimidating at the very best of times, but as far as I was concerned, Mickey Mouse could be selling me a house, as long as I was fully satisfied with what I was buying. And by the looks of things, this house that was eloquently presented to us by Mr. Foldforth seemed to tick all the right boxes. "So what do you think of the house?" Mr. Foldforth asked me earnestly, with wide grey eyes displaying his obvious eagerness to please, and his clandestine longing to acquire his very first sale. I wouldn't have been surprised if he'd actually been crossing his fingers and toes. "I know it requires a very little work, but it's in excellent shape, as you can see. And for the money, you're looking at a steal here. You don't get houses like this at such a remarkably good price. The fact is, it requires only a little work, and the owners have dropped the price because of this. Any work you do on this place won't cost very much, in the grand scheme of things. It's a sound investment, if you ask me. And you did say you wanted a house with lots of character, and I'm sure you will agree that this place practically oozes charm out of its pores.
It's got a benevolent, serene energy about it, don't you think? Some of those huge, masterful-looking trees in the wood grove are over 300 years old, you know, and you don't get that everywhere. There are some fabulous riding trails in these parts, so if you're a keen rider, you won't be remotely disappointed. A lot of people around here keep horses and go riding. There is a pristine stable block on this property that was built 30 years ago. It's in excellent condition, as good as new. So if you want to keep horses, you're good to go. There is also a red storage barn to keep all the hay and stuff. It's efficient, very good setup it is. Everything is in apple pie order. I would say the interior of the house could do with some fixing up. Let's not kid about that. There are a few dodgy floorboards that are a little wobbly, and some windows that need fixing up. But there's no major work, so it's a blessing. As you probably noticed when we drove down the drive, there are fenced-in areas of alpine fields on the property, and I'm told the prepossessing views over the horizon are particularly spectacular in the mornings and early evenings. You can sit back comfortably and watch them on the stunning wraparound porch. This extensive, sprawling property, you will be glad to know, boasts 2 well-stocked ponds, and it's perfect to raise a young family, said Mr. Foldforth, watching me and my wife Patsy for any signs of enthusiasm on our parts. It would appear that Patsy gave him exactly what he wanted, so the estate agent's uncertain face broke out into a broad, satisfied grin, and his showy display of perfect white teeth brought out the light in his grey eyes. "I love it," said Patsy. "Really love it. It's the best house we've ever been shown so far. You're not wrong. The place oozes a plethora of character. Unlike the last 2 houses we saw today, which were so sterile in my opinion. How old did you say this house was? It's definitely not modern. Some of the stonework in the walls is spectacular. You wouldn't get that today, unless you paid an arm and a leg for it." "I think it's about 100 years old. I'll have to check up on the details. I'm sure you will agree the high ceilings, large fireplaces, and emphasis on open-plan living is highly desirable, and very much in fashion today." My wife removed her sunglasses from her face to look directly into Mr. Foldforth's eyes, and in a stern, no-nonsense tone of voice she said, "I want the truth, Mr. Foldforth. Why did the owners of this place put the property on the market? Why would anybody want to sell a place like this? This is the kind of house you'd pass through down the generations, from one family member to the next. It's got a heritage quality about it. Even though compared to some historic buildings, it's obviously reasonably young, but it's an investment nevertheless. I mean, this is not the sort of house that easily comes on the market." The guarded estate agent was somewhat thrown off his perch by my wife's direct insinuations. He glanced again nervously towards the white BMW, in the hope of salvation, where the real estate agent was sitting in the driver's side seat, talking and laughing on his cell phone, and not looking our way. The young estate agent looked almost desperate, as if silently begging his colleague to leap out of his car and come to his immediate rescue, the moment any awkward questions arose to throw a spanner in the works. Seconds later, his colleague in the car, as if on cue, did happen to look up in our direction. I do not believe for a moment the estate agent picked up his colleague's pleading looks. Instead, he gave Mr. Foldforth a thumbs up, a nod, and a broad grin. So I guess Mr. Foldforth realised he was on his own and needed to handle our questions without any help. I did notice he seemed somewhat rattled, as if he was now completely out of his depth and had been thrown to the wolves, so I couldn't help but feel somewhat sympathetic towards him. But I also had a profound sense that he had something to tell us about the house that would not be easy to digest. I could not imagine what it was that he was going to tell us. I was secretly hoping there wasn't an infestation of termites in the wood, of which there was an ubiquitous amount throughout the entire property, as that would take vast expense to sort out, and problems like that are not nice.
Maybe it was something a whole lot worse than that, as all kinds of unpleasant suggestions crawled inappropriately into my mind, that I wantonly swatted away by trying to remain positively upbeat. I drew in a deep breath to steady myself. In my brief tour around the property, I knew I wanted to buy this place with all my heart. I could tell Patsy was on exactly the same page as me. She was trying to mask her over-enthusiasm, with little success, but her eyes were as bright as two lampposts, so her eagerness was pretty transparent, and she was hoping as much as I was that nothing was going to jeopardize our opportunity to buy this place. I had a sinking feeling that something just might, and that we would ultimately have to go back to the drawing board and resume our house hunting again. The intrepid journey of looking for the quintessential perfect house had not been an easy one. We had faced one bitter disappointment after another. Certainly the last house we'd put an offer on, which we rarely liked, appeared to have slipped through our fingers like butter rolling down a corn cob. I was hoping it wasn't going to happen all over again, but if I was a betting man, I was pretty sure that a similar unfortunate scenario would likely play out, with this house, that is. It was not that I was inclined to negativity. It was simply buying houses requires being at the right place at the right time, as much can go wrong. It's a little like playing the lottery.
I think we better go indoors to sit down for a little while,
Mr. Foldforth told us, with grey eyes dappled in a cloud of anxiety that he failed to hide from us.
I do happen to have something to tell the both of you concerning this property that you're interested in.
In that moment my wife's widening eyes met mine, and I could read her thoughts as if they were as transparent as a pane of glass. I told you it was too good to be true. It's happening all over again. We're going to lose this place, like the last house we lost. Why is this happening to us all over again? Now we're going to hear why we do not want to buy this place, she almost whispered into my mind. I gave my wife an encouraging wink, but I knew she wasn't looking forward to hearing what Mr. Foldforth had to tell us. All kinds of grim, inauspicious thoughts began to fold into my mind, like a collection of roasted nuts being blended into a frothy meringue, from the house being haunted to someone dying on the premises. But none of those things would have really put me off the place. I could envisage myself living here. It was the second time a house had reached out to me, tugged at my heartstrings in this way. In truth, I never believed that bricks and mortar could have such a mesmerizing, powerful allure on me as this house had done. But yes, I could see me and my wife raising our kids here. I reckoned it would take me a lot to be put off this place. I could live with a ghost frolicking around the house, within limits, of course. And certainly if someone had died on the property, it wasn't a train smash. If the worst came to the worst, we could always get the house blessed by a priest. I imagine there are lots of old houses out there where people had died on the premises. In truth, it didn't worry me in the slightest, as usually in those cases there is nothing to worry about. I knew I had to rather gallantly brace myself for what I was about to hear from Mr. Foldforth, who had grown unusually solemn, and his demeanour suggested that what he had to tell us was not exactly good. I twisted my fingers nervously as I sat back on a comfortable, beautiful upholstered wing chair in the spacious, well-appointed living room, with its stunning wood-panelled walls and huge magnanimous fireplace, and walnut wall-to-ceiling bookshelves that boasted a vast collection of spectacular leather-bound books, some that looked to be first editions, and were possibly worth a sizable fortune. The room nostalgically smelt of leather and furniture polish. Mr. Foldforth rubbed his chin and said,
"The Warringtons have finally decided to sell this property, after what happened so tragically over 9 years ago. As you can easily imagine, it wasn't an easy decision on their parts to make, to sell this delightful property, of which they are naturally attached to. But sometimes you do what you have to do, if your level of comfort has been compromised, which ultimately is what happened to the family, I'm afraid to say." "The Warringtons," I said, raising a questionable brow. "Now that is a familiar name. Where do I know it from? Ah, yes, I remember. I was at school, you know, with a Chuck Warrington. He was quite the show-off back in the day, a comedian. Full of nonsense he was. He had a lovely twin sister, Chloe, who told me not to believe a word that ever came out of his mouth. But despite everything, he was a good kid, you know. We hung out a lot at my house back in the day. Our parents were good friends with the Warringtons, you see. Now I haven't seen those two in many years. It doesn't happen to be the same Warrington family, by any chance. You wouldn't happen to know. I do believe you've got the right Warrington family. I hasten to say that Chuck Warrington is the one who put this property on the market, Mr. Foldforth admitted to me. I understand his parents owned this house. This was where Chuck Warrington was raised with his twin sister Chloe, and you're right, that is her name. His mother did not want to have anything to do with this house after what happened here, and in the circumstances I can quite understand her feelings in regards to the matter." As Mr. Foldforth told me all this, I privately ruminated that in the wood grove on this very property was where Chuck claimed to have encountered a Bigfoot with his sister, and now all these years later, based on what had happened to me on that hike, I was inclined to actually believe his story. I marvelled how somewhere in the wood grove those two young children had had an incredulous encounter, all of their own, that wasn't as spectacular as mine was, but that was besides the point, as in my book any encounter was pretty special. "Good gracious me," I said. This time it was me rubbing my chin reflectively. "It's a small world, that's for sure." My wife frowned at me, as we were going off topic, and Patsy hated going off topic. She couldn't stand that. She wanted to know the nuts and bolts about what happened on this property, and my wistful nostalgic memories of old friendships were getting rudely in the way of her fervent inquiries. "More to the point, why are they selling this house?" she interjected, fixing her eyes steadily on Mr. Foldforth, who was looking a little like a fish out of water that needed a quick rescue at this point. Mr. Foldforth bit his lip awkwardly. Inwardly, I suspect he was grimacing. He said very gingerly, "I hope, Mrs. Turnbull, that I'm not going to put you off buying this property, because I can see you are very taken by the place. But I am expected to answer your questions, and so I will do so as best I can, even though what happened here is irrelevant in my book. It was an awfully long time ago, 9 years ago to be exact, so I think it hardly counts in the circumstances. Nevertheless, I will tell you." "I take it, Mr. Foldforth, that something bad happened here. You might as well tell us what it is, and quit procrastinating," said my wife brusquely. "Sorry, my wife can be a wee bit abrupt," I said, quickly intervening, giving my wife a scolding look, as if to warn her to mind her tongue. It was certainly uncalled for her to be so rude and so abrasive, but my wife could be unbridled at the very best of times, and I was always having to rein her in like a wild mare, even though she was much better than she used to be. But there were times she made me want to pull my own hair out, and this was certainly one of them. If he was offended, Mr. Foldforth hid it masterfully well. He folded one leg over the other rather protectively, removing his zooty spectacles from his face, wiping them down with his handkerchief that he had pulled out from the top pocket of his suit. This I took to be a self-soothing gesture on his part, a way of skilfully distracting himself, while giving us some sobering news that we were not exactly eager to hear. Why was it that whenever you really, really wanted something really, really badly, there was always that highly annoying but attached to the price tag, which would always make you begin to doubt your purchase and wonder if you should buy it at all? I clenched my teeth, hoping and praying that I could stomach what he was about to tell us. but the look on his face scared the hell out of me. "That's right," said Mr. Foldforth, rubbing the pristine glass of his frames with his handkerchief very vigorously, as if the impeccable lenses were filthy dirty, which they certainly were not. This successfully he did, I suspected, to avoid our intense gaze. "You're very right in your deductions, Mrs. Turnbull. Something bad happened here. Very, very bad. Chuck's father, Mr. Warrington, was killed on this property in an inexplicable, mysterious way that baffled even the coroner at the time, whom had never seen anything like it before or since. One does not know exactly what happened to the poor man, but let's just say it was nasty. Very, very nasty. And I guess you just don't forget something like that." My wife's brows popped up above her eyes quite sharply, furrowing into many enigmatic puzzle lines. "Sorry, say that again. The owner of this house was killed on the property. I don't understand. How did this happen? And what do you mean exactly by mysterious?" "That's what I mean, Mrs. Turnbull. No one knows precisely what happened to him, although I dare say the family know more than they're actually saying. If you talk to them about the event, they skirt over it as if they're hiding something," he said, replacing his glasses and looking directly from me to my wife. "I'm not sure what happened, but they found Mr. Warrington lying from a tree with his head hanging off his neck at a rather odd angle. It almost appeared as if his face had been bludgeoned, stripped off his head, as if it had melted away like candle wax. It wasn't pretty by any manner of means, I'm told. And as I say, it is paradoxically bizarre, one of life's unorthodox mysteries, you could say, but enough to distress the entire family quite significantly, and was probably the sole reason that this place was put on the market. I guess Chuck Warrington decided to sell, and you cannot blame him for that." "So let's get this right. You're saying that Mr. Warrington was killed in the wood grove on this property, and no one knows precisely what happened to him. But it would seem that something or someone must have attacked him, for his face to have been bludgeoned like that," said my wife. "Pretty much, I guess," said Mr. Foldforth gingerly. "I know it's incredibly off-putting to hear, but I'm sure it's a once-in-a-lifetime tragic event. An accident, of course, that will never happen again. As to who or what did this to Mr. Warrington, your guess is as good as mine. As a consequence, I do know the family was traumatized by the event, as you can expect. They moved away from the property forthwith. They haven't lived in it since the incident. I imagine they were terrified of anything else untoward happening to them. Once you've had a nasty shock like that, you're never quite the same again, are you? You're bound to be fearful. I know I would be. Let me assure you, Mrs. Turnbull, that if this distressed you in any way, it is one of those outlandish things that can happen in life for reasons unknown, where invariably answers and explanations can never be found. I will say this, however, that I unequivocally believe in the saying that lightning rarely ever strikes in the same place twice. I remember when I was a child, we had a tree on our property that had been struck by lightning. My father used to always say to our family, it was the safest place on our property outdoors in a storm. Where that tree had been struck, I unequivocally believe he was right. I will cordially remind you, Mrs. Turnbull, that this fortuitous sad event happened 9 years ago. Let's just say Chuck Warrington has been letting out the premises ever since, to a family that lived here for the remainder of that time. and from what I gleaned from them, nothing untoward ever happened on the property again, to lead them to be concerned over their own safety, which is good news indeed.
I won't pretend, Mr. Foldforth, that what you've actually revealed to us is not rather disturbing, to say the very least, and incredibly off-putting, said my wife. Something or someone clearly harmed Mr. Warrington in the Woodgrove, and the question is who or what. I don't care that it happened a long time ago. I can only hope that the threat has gone, whatever that threat actually was.
As I was saying, Mrs. Turnbull, I really believe that if there was anything to concern yourself with, other people who lived in this premises would have likely experienced something unfortunate over the years, but they never did. They have only reported good things about this place. The father has been unfortunately transferred to a job in Boise in Idaho. Otherwise, they would have been quite happy to continue renting from the Warringtons. It was when the occupying family gave notice to Chuck that he decided that it was finally time to put the place on the market. He did admit to me that had he not lost his father so tragically in this way, the house would likely have remained in the family line. But I guess the place has been indelibly soiled by a rather bad experience.
All of a sudden, the other realtor, who'd been sitting in the white BMW, came sauntering into the house with an air of great professionalism that rather overshadowed Mr. Foldforth. He greeted us with a bright, warm, sunny smile, and spoke in a very posh voice that made me believe he'd been educated at an expensive private boys' school. There was definitely a pretentious plum in his mouth. He was incredibly posh in every regard, with an English twang to his American accent that made me suspect he'd lived in England at some point.
"My name is Nicholas Patcher," he said. "Tell me, how has my colleague been doing? He's new to the game, you see, and I'm showing him the ropes. So your feedback on his dealings with you will be invaluable." "He's been incredibly helpful," I said. "Glad to hear it," said Mr. Patcher, rubbing his hands gleefully. "I got the impression back there, when I was sitting in my BMW, watching you folk from a distance, that the two of you like very much what you've seen. I've been in the property game long enough to know when people are taken by a place, nothing gets past my nose. I will admit it is a delightful property, a sound investment. I wouldn't mind snapping it up myself. It's the perfect sort of house to raise a family, if you're intending to have children," he said, looking at us suggestively, almost as if he instinctively knew that children were very much planned on the horizon of our lives. "This fabulous house boasts 5-bedroom and bathroom en suites. Personally, I love the emphasis on open-plan living here, where the rooms seamlessly fold into each other. I understand the architect who designed this place over 100 years ago was way ahead of his time. His name was Robert Spader. He has designed spectacular, illustrious properties in these parts, which are so classic they never go out of fashion. They are what we call in my profession timeless and traditional. In my book, it doesn't get better than that. You have no idea, Mr. Turnbull, how many modern places these days that were so in for their time have become rarely passé and outmoded. But this place will always be current, even in another 100 years' time, I suspect." When Mr. Patcher had finished his little spiel, Mr. Foldforth's bashful face dropped to his knees, and then he hurriedly blurted out, "I'm sorry, Mr. Patcher, but I told the Turnbulls here about, that unfortunate incident that happened here 9 years ago." Mr. Patcher's face suddenly grew sombre, like a dark thundercloud. He looked quite taken aback
by Mr. Foldforth's startling confession, almost as if someone had suddenly thrown ice-cold water all over his face. I got the impression that he had not expected his colleague to be so forthcoming in regard to this information concerning the house, and I witnessed him offering Mr. Foldforth a formidable glare, which I read between the lines to mean,
"What the hell do you think you're doing, disclosing private information like this to potential clients? A hair's breadth away from signing a contract with us. Do you really want to lose this sale?"
Mr. Patcher cleared his throat awkwardly. He said,
"As a general practice, Mr. and Mrs. Turnbill, we don't make a habit of disclosing irrelevant information like this that is inconsequential. It happened a long time ago and has no bearing on this sale whatsoever. I'm sure you can appreciate that."
Mr. Foldforth looked embarrassed. His face grew so red that even the skin on his neck area pinkened significantly. He looked rather sheepish and bashful, like a boy who'd been reprimanded by the head teacher for insolent behaviour. As if sensing he needed to redeem the situation and soften the blow of what Mr. Foldforth had told us, Mr. Nicholas Patcher puffed up his chest like a penguin to make himself appear bigger and more important than he actually was. He let out a mock laugh and shook his head of black curls very vigorously.
"A tragic incident concerning Mr. Warrington's inexplicable passing is what happened an awfully long time ago. 9 years ago, to be exact, as Mr. Foldforth, I'm sure, has told you. That kind of thing would never happen again. It's one of life's bizarre, enigmatic curiosities that cannot be explained. And yes, it was desperately sad. You should not go upsetting our clients, Mr. Foldforth. It is not necessary to do so. They don't need to know all this about the property. As I was telling you, Mr. and Mr. Turnbill, since the incident, grievous as it was, I'm sure you agree, this house has been occupied by tenants who have rented this place for 9 long years, and there have been no other unfortunate incidents here to suggest that something so dreadful could ever happen again. Absolutely not. I mean, look around you at this place. It's a dream property, designed by an esteemed architect revered for his day. What is there not to love about the place?"
"Mr. Patcher, I'm not going to lie to you, but it is a concern what Mr. Foldforth has kindly divulged to us," interjected my wife. "I am grateful he took the liberty to share this important information with us. It is significant to know these things, in my opinion. And contrary to what you may believe, I don't actually care if it happened 20, 30, or even 100 years ago. I like to know the history of a place that I'm investing in. Think about it for a moment. Mr. Warrington, who was Chuck's father, he went into that wood grove, and the next thing you know, he's hanging from a tree with his head dangling off his neck, his face almost removed from his head. That is quite terrible."
"With the greatest respect, Mrs. Turnbill, I don't agree with you on this one. For a start, as a realtor, we aren't obliged to concern ourselves with things that happened 9 years ago. No one ever does. It really shouldn't put you off buying this property. If there was a threat in that wood grove, I'm sure it's long since gone. Whatever that threat may have been, if indeed there was one. You never know what happened to Mr. Warrington. It could have been personal, could it not? Maybe he upset someone greatly. It wouldn't be the first time that had happened. And if it was personal, it will not affect you living on this premises, as that vengeful person that came after Mr. Warrington, if indeed that is what happened, is not going to come after you, are they?"
"Look, Mr. Patcher, I know you mean well, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Foldforth for kindly telling us about the unfortunate incident. So please don't come down on him hard like a ton of bricks. He did the right thing professionally telling us about this. What I will say is that me and my husband are going to have to think long and hard about whether we want to buy the property, said my wife obsequiously. Mr. Patcher looked heartily relieved. He rubbed his sweaty hand on his pinstripe suit, and his troubled eyes became significantly brighter, as if not all hope had been lost.
So you are still going to consider buying this place, are you? I assure you that you are getting it for a song. Prices like this for a highly sought-after property, superbly designed, do not come along very often. Mr. Pratcher, I'm with my wife on this one. We are both considering buying this place. We like it very much, I interjected. But we do need a little time to reflect over everything before we make any fast decisions. The story about Mr. Warrington's grisly fate has somewhat blown a spanner in the works, especially since I knew of the man. Don't be too long about it, Mr. Turnbull. I feel I should warn you, places like this have a nasty habit of being snapped up rather fast. It's only been on the market for a couple of days now, and as you're the only two people who have seen the place, as it's in quite a sequestered location, you would be a fool to pass this one by, in my humble opinion.
As we climbed into the car to drive away from the property, my wife's face was contorted with frustration. Don't you think Mr. Patcher was behaving rather shiftily? I mean, over what happened to Mr. Warrington. He gave us minimum details, don't you think? He was so obviously vague, skirted over everything. I don't care if that fortuitous event happened 20 years ago. We have a right to know about the history of the property. Did you see how worried Mr. Patcher looked when he thought that he'd lost the sale? Honestly, these estate agents can be so transparent. He looked like he wanted to bite poor Mr. Foldforth's head off because he told us the story. Poor man, I feel so sorry for him. Maybe he's too honest to be an estate agent.
So what do you actually feel about the property, love? I asked my wife. Do you think knowing what happened to Mr. Warrington all those years ago can put you off buying the place? I mean, whatever you may say about Mr. Pratcher, the truth is he is right. The chances of what happened to Mr. Warrington happening again are as remote as winning the lottery, I suspect.
My wife was momentarily reflective. I think if the truth be told, whoever killed Mr. Warrington did so intentionally, that's for sure. It must have been a personal vendetta of some kind. That, as you say, will probably not impact our lives at all. But given you were friends with Chuck Warrington all those years ago, it makes sense for you to look him up. Catch up with him again. Find out what really happened to his father. If you ask me, there's more to the story than actually meets the eye. If we're satisfied by what he tells us, we can put an offer in on the house at once. And I'd like to do that very much. I can't deny I love the place. It's the best place I've seen in an awfully long time. In my opinion, houses like this don't come on the market very often, so you do need to get in touch with your old friend as soon as you possibly can, before the place slips through our fingers like the last house we liked did.
All well and good, love, but I feel uncomfortable getting in touch with Chuck Warrington. It's been a long time. I wasn't always terribly nice to him when I was young. I only hung around with him and his sister, as my parents were very good friends with his parents. Otherwise, I'd probably have not given Chuck the time of day. I always thought he was filled with hot air, and as a consequence I had little time for him, and his practical jokes, of course.
Honestly, listen to yourself. What's your problem, sweetheart? Stop being so reticent and so evasive. So what if you haven't seen him for many years? And so what if you didn't treat him that great back then? You can apologise for that, can't you? You've grown up since then and seen the error of your ways. Kids can be cruel at times, but when they grow up, I'm sure they regret their bad behaviours. It'll be a perfect opportunity for you to clear the air between the both of you, will it not? To make amends. And that's a good thing, isn't it? Patsy, my wife, could be terribly pushy at the best of times. I knew she wasn't going to let this one go. She would not allow me to wimp out on seeing my old friend again. So I knew I was going to have to take the bull by the horns and pluck up the courage to get in touch with Chuck Warrington again. I will admit I was reluctant to do so. My last memory of interacting with him was telling him that nothing that ever came out of his mouth could ever be trusted. Furthermore, I had ridiculed him about his Bigfoot encounter that he claimed to have had, which I told him at the time was just complete nonsense. I wondered how he'd feel about my getting in contact with him after all these years. Would he even want to give me the time of day, given how dismissively I had treated him back then? Let's just say, had I been Chuck Warrington, I'd likely want nothing to do with the likes of me. But it turned out Chuck Warrington was a nicer man than I was, and his reception towards me was surprisingly warm. I hasten to say when he realised it was me on the phone, he was rather taken aback.
It's been so long, bro. It's been years. How are you doing? I'm doing great, I said. Glad to hear that, bro. It's a surprise, I admit, to hear from you. A good one, of course, but this is a turn-up for the books, is it not? It is, isn't it? I said gingerly. I'm wondering, Chuck, if we might get together for a drink and a light meal, perhaps, in Spokane. I understand you live there. I've something important I'd like to discuss with you. Now you've got me intrigued. Yes, I do live in Spokane, as it happens, so meeting with you at dinner on Friday night will be great. I'm married now with my wife Cindy. We have a 3-year-old kid called Keegan. My wife always gives me Fridays off to meet up with the lads. So yes, it will be cool to see you again and to catch up on all your news.
So there I was, sitting at a table in a diner in town that Chuck had chosen, when the man himself approached me. My face just dropped in surprise. Growing up, Chuck had always been a little on the podgy side, based on the fact that he loved his food. So I barely recognised the man as he approached me. Chuck Warrington looked like he should be on the cover of a very current, trendy man's magazine. His body was so chiselled and firm, and streamlined with muscles in all the right places. I was the one that felt conspicuously dumpy and rather self-conscious by comparison, even though I thought I was in relatively good shape, but now I wasn't quite so sure. I was certainly no Adonis or Greek god, and Chuck looked like the Michelangelo's David. I got up to greet him cautiously, but he magnanimously threw an arm around my back and slapped it. He seemed genuinely thrilled to see me, and I was touched by his warmth.
It's good to see you, bro. It really is. It's been a long time. But the good news is you haven't changed very much. Well, you look incredible, Chuck, I said, unable to disguise my admiration. Oh, you mean this, he grinned, patting his cast-iron flashboard belly appreciatively. I used to be quite chubby back in the day when you knew me, did I not? Times have changed, as you can see. I'm a personal trainer these days. My job is to nip people into shape with diet and exercise regimes. So I have to set a good example to those that I preach to. Let's just say once I worked on transforming myself. I made it my life's mission to help others like me, who needed similar help in that regard. Let's just say no one understands a fat person more than a former fat person, he said, chuckling. Back in the day, I used to eat and eat, anything and everything. But nowadays, my body is a temple. Well, you look good, I said, really good. I feel somewhat intimidated. You intimidated? I don't buy that for a second, laughed Chuck, cocking his head to one side. Never. You always had it all together growing up. I was the one that was all over the place. My inability to concentrate during classes made the teachers as mad as hell, did it not? Before long, the waitress came over to take our orders, and Chuck and I got caught up in a light banter, discussing the people we had known at school and where they were now. I was to discover Chuck's twin sister was running her own little mobile pooch parlour,
where she made a living grooming other people's dogs. She was now happily married with a baby on the way, expected in a couple of months. And Mrs. Warrington, their mother, lived on the premises with her in her house in Spokane, while Chuck Warrington lived next door to his sister and mother with his own wife and 3-year-old child, which I thought was cool, as they'd always been a tight-knit family, and I suspect after Mr. Warrington's passing, the family stuck together all the more these days.
So tell me, what is all this about? You contacted me about something important that you wished to speak to me about,
asked Chuck, taking a sip of his beer so some of the foam stuck to his upper lip, which he very neatly wiped away with the back of his hand.
If you must know, it's about the property you're selling. I understand it was your childhood home. Me and my wife Patsy, we viewed the place a day ago. We really like it, Chuck. We're considering putting in an offer. Imagine my surprise when I discovered it belonged to you. I don't think I ever visited your house as a boy. You always came to us. It was never the other way round. Probably because it's in quite a remote location. The estate agent, Mr. Foldforth, told us what happened to your father in the woodgrove on the property. The incident gave us cause for concern, as naturally we want to bring up a family on the premises, and we don't want to encounter any nasty surprises along the way, if you get my drift.
Chuck almost choked on his beer when he digested the fact that I was interested in buying his house, and wanted to know what had happened to his father.
Oh, by the way, I must apologize,
I said, remembering to mind my manners.
I forgot to say how dreadfully sorry I am that you lost your father in such an awful way. I can't imagine what it must have been like for all of you. I'm sorry I only heard about it now. It was tough, said Chuck soberly. My mother's never been the same after the incident. It was dreadful and hard on us all. As you can imagine, based on what transpired, she could never go back to the house again. So I've been renting the place for years now. The last tenants lived there for 9 years, but they recently gave me notice. I decided to sell on behalf of my mother, to liquidate the funds. It seemed like a good idea, as renting had become quite tiresome. So what did happen to your father, Chuck? I asked inquiringly.
Chuck dropped his head sorrowfully to his beer glass, studying the foam. He avoided my gaze, almost as if he was weighing up in his mind whether he should tell me what had really happened to his father.
I'm not sure I should tell you, Jaden, he said gingerly. I don't think you would believe me. You always thought I was full of baloney growing up, and the last thing I need is to be ridiculed by you or anyone else for that matter. Look, bro, I said obsequiously, I'm really sorry how I treated you back then. It was unacceptable. I do admit I pompously and arrogantly, presumptuously thought you were full of nonsense, because you wanted to be the class clown. You loved showing off, even if it meant making up fictitious wild stories. But for the record, I do believe the story you told me about the Bigfoot you saw with your sister. I know at the time I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. But if I can redeem myself in any way, I do believe you now. You do? Asked Chuck, looking at me with a raised brow. You surprise me, Jaden. Why the sudden change of heart? You've always been rigidly stubborn, hardwired not to trust any story that challenges your belief system. So why have you softened all of a sudden? Because, if you want to know the truth, I've seen a Bigfoot myself, I blurted out. There's nothing like being faced with the truth head on to help you actually believe in it. You've seen a Bigfoot? Asked Chuck incredulously. I'd love to have seen your face when you saw it, he chuckled. It must have torn the roof off the paradigm you have of the world. Now that would have been hilarious to watch. Pity you didn't have your face on camera. That would have been comedy of the best kind. I will admit, I said, the moment I saw the Bigfoot I thought of you, Chuck, and your story, of course. I felt truly ashamed, It was like a cold slap in the face for me, and a big wake-up call, let me tell you. You could say I realized the story I thought you had fabricated to get attention, I realized was probably true, and that I had been an idiot to have doubted you. I remember at the time thinking you were serious when you told me the story. So if you were not pulling my leg, you sounded truthful. But I guess I programmed myself to doubt your integrity. Chuck sighed. I assure you, bro, I did like to be the center of attention back in the day. I don't doubt that at all. I'm the first to admit that, but believe me when I say to you, I'd never use a fictitious Bigfoot story to win friends. That would be insane. I mean, who wants to be ridiculed? I know I certainly don't. You make a good point there, Chuck. But seriously, bro, I haven't shared my story with anyone for the very same reason. So I get where you're coming from. I want to apologize for how I behaved back then. The truth is, I was the one that was full of myself, not you. But I didn't see it at the time. I was blind to my sense of haughty self-importance. Well, you were a bit of a know-it-all back in the day, weren't you? Laughed Chuck. You were quite snooty and sucking up to the teachers like no one else's business. You were one of those annoying pupils that always had your hand up to answer all the questions in class. You got brilliant grades, of course, didn't you? And the teachers loved the bones of you, while they loved to hate me. We were intrinsic opposites in that regard, were we not? We were thrust together due to our parents, even though we had little in common. I hated being in the classroom. I got so bored during lessons. I would do anything to alleviate that boredom of mine, like throwing wet tissue across the classroom. And I know I disrupted classes, but sometimes I couldn't help myself. I probably spent more time in the head's office writing on a piece of paper 1,000 times over and over again that I was dreadfully sorry for being a nuisance in class. Whereas when you went to the head, undoubtedly he was clapping you on the back in congratulation for another A++, I suspect. I remember all that, I admitted, but people rarely liked you, Chuck. You were funny, humorous, you made everybody laugh. I'll certainly give you that. You were popular too. You were the class comedian back in the day. You had tons of friends. Everybody liked you. I, on the other hand, was boringly rigid. I was less popular, hanging around with pompous people who were as stuffy as I was. I should have let my hair down a little bit. Maybe I rebelled later on in life because, believe it or not, I married a very controversial woman that my parents couldn't stand. The first time I ever got my parents back up, I have to say. Well, I seem to remember your parents were pretty strict, weren't they? Said Chuck. Your father was always insisting on getting good grades. He expected the best from you. I do remember staying over at your place one night, and your father sat in on us while we all did our homework, and only when the timer went off did he let us do our own thing. I guess you were just a product of your rigidly stiff upbringing. Anyway, if you really want to know what happened to my father, I will tell you. But a big warning, it's not pretty. I want to hear it all, I said. Chuck's account. 9 years ago, Jaden. Like you, I was 20 years old back then, still living at home with both of my parents, and, of course, my non-identical twin sister, you know. Of course, you hadn't seen me then, but I had transformed my body. I had become reasonably strong and very fit. I was studying to become an ACSM personal trainer, which means you have the scientific knowledge and know-all to work in a fitness facility. I was also studying to become a nutrition coach to help people with their diets. One day my father enlisted me to help him cut back a few trees in the woodgrove. We like to keep the pathways for riding clear, for easy access to the public riding trail. which was like a sprawling labyrinth of widespread trails that led across some spectacular parts of wilderness. My father, as you can imagine, was a keen horse rider, hence the stable blocks on our property that I'm sure you've seen. So keeping the trails clear for riding was very important for him. So he enlisted my help with the project. When Mr. Foldforth showed you around our property the other day, you probably became acutely aware of how spectacular some of those ancient trees are. Tall, lofty, gargantuan in size, quite magnificent they are. As you can imagine, they attract a lot of exotic bird life, along with other indigenous species onto the property. It's common for us to have deer coming there, especially when the apple trees in the orchard are bursting with fruit. We've had all kinds of visitors over the years, including a family of cougars, where the mother brought several litters of her cubs to kittenishly prance around our property. She was showing them off to us. Of that we were in no doubt. I mean, you go into the grove, and the bird song is absolutely extraordinary. There is nothing quite like it. It's soothing and tranquilizing, to say the very least. I remember me and my father went through the woodgrove, deciding what needed to be cut away, what needed pruning, what needed pulling out, stuff like that. We found an area in our woods that was very strange. We had never seen it before. It veered off the beaten path. But me and my father realized that if we cut away some of those trees in that part of the grove, we could create another trail that led to another footpath, a public one at that. In this outlandish part of the woodgrove, me and my father discovered a couple of dead trees had been deliberately planted upside down, with their roots dangling in the air. It got our immediate, undivided attention. I think my father's words were, "What the hell? What is going on here? Let's not kid. We'd never seen anything like this before a day in our lives. It was like this treacherous part of the woods was projecting a hostile, perfidious, menacious intent towards us, as if warning us to keep away. I could feel danger signs flashing in my head like bright red lights, almost as if a little voice inside me was whispering, 'Keep out, if you know what's good for you.' I promise you it felt incredibly off, almost as if we were intruding in an iniquitous space where we were not remotely welcome. Everything was eerily still, hauntingly quiet. You felt as if you could hear a pin drop, and if you heard a crackle of a dry leaf or something like that, you practically jumped out of your skin, as the sound would scream in the deadly silence. I felt disquieting chills trickling down the back of my spine, as if something entrenched deep inside my gut was remonstrating an internal warning within me to keep well away from this place. And if that was not bad enough, there were peculiar, gruesome features swinging from the old oak tree, dangling precariously from the branches, tied together with leather thongs. These insidious decorations, whatever you choose to call them, were hideously ugly, vulgar, vile, creepy. They were like dolls made from grass and sticks that were sinister to look at, rather reminding me of the Blair Witch Project, which I remember seeing on television a while ago. We examined the tree decorated with these strange, abnormal symbols that I knew meant something. My father said again, "What the hell is going on here? It's like something or someone is warning us to keep away." Why does this place feel so dark? We also found areas where clusters of stones were gathered together. Sticks were sticking through them at odd, peculiar angles, but every stone and every stick seemed to convey some kind of code that we could not read or interpret or comprehend. But I knew the energy in this place was malevolent, as if it resonated with the lowest vibration of the darkest entities you can imagine. I knew there was meaning behind all this madness, and I told my father that we should ignore this part of the woodgrove. Something or someone doesn't want us here. I don't feel good about opening out this path. Besides, we don't need to do it, do we? Not really. The paths around here are big enough. We've got many of them through the grove for the horses. So we don't need to do this as far as I'm concerned. My father said to me, "I'm sorry, son. I don't agree with you. I wouldn't read too much into all these ugly signs. It's probably kids having a laugh. My bet it's the Knackerstop kids. They're behind this. I'm sure they are. I understand from their mother Gloria they're always up to mischief, and I've caught them myself a couple of times on our property. So you mark my words, they did this, son." I shrugged my shoulders and said, "But why would they do this, Dad? For what reason would they do it?" "Kids having fun, of course," said my father. "When I was a child, I loved scaring the bejesus out of my mother." "I'm sorry, Dad," I said. "I don't think the Knackerstop kids did this. I mean, would they be even strong enough to plant a tree in the ground upside down? With the greatest of respect, I don't think they could do it, Dad. I think something is warning for us not to come near this place. Honestly, son, listen to yourself. This is our woodgrove, and I think opening up an extra path by cutting back some of these large trees is an excellent idea. We can start tomorrow with the project. I'm not happy about this, Dad, at all. The main trail through the trees for the horses is good enough, surely. Why do we need another? Why not another? The more the merrier, my father said to me. It'll make the rides more diverse, don't you think? More interesting. I, for one, am not going to be intimidated by a few ominous symbols scattered around the grove. Very well. Have it your way, I said. I will help you. But just so you know, I'm not happy about this at all. The next morning, me and my father began cutting away a couple of trees in that ominous part of the woodgrove. I was filled with a sense of impending dread. It was like a deep voice inside my head was urging me not to do this, to stop at once. I do remember at one point I felt as if we were being watched, as if eyes were drilling into the back of my neck. I expressed my extreme misgivings to my father, but he laughed dismissively at me and literally overlooked my worries, assuring me that I was the one that was being ridiculous, that I was overreacting, that I was being dramatic. I know he did not feel that we were being watched like I did. All of a sudden, we heard the most horrifying scream. It was the most petrifying, ear-piercing sound that I have ever heard. It was like someone was being murdered. The sound sent chills coursing down my spine. My heart thundered and boomed violently in my chest. I began to shake like a leaf. I knew at once we were in perilous danger. We were messing with something we did not understand. My father immediately cocked his head, raised a brow, and said, "What the hell was that?" I began trembling again. I couldn't stop shaking. I looked at my father through frightened eyes that were round and wide and as large as dinner plates, and I pleaded with him obsequiously, Dad, let's get out of here now. Let's get out of here now. Something is watching us. We need to get out of here. My father remained resolutely stubborn, insouciantly indifferent. I think, of course, he was startled by the strange screams, but he wasn't easily put off, and told me once again that I was overreacting. It's probably one of those squawking birds you get, he told me. Believe me, they can scream really badly. Not like this, Dad, I said. Nothing screams like this, I told him sharply. I'm sorry, Dad. You're deluding yourself. There was no way that was a bird. With all my heart, soul, and might, I wanted to run out of the woodgrove as fast as my legs could carry me. Get the hell out of there. But I couldn't leave my father alone. He would be vulnerable without me there. I was glad we had come into the grove with our rifles for protection, although in a strange way they seemed almost pathetic compared to that sound. Then we heard the discombobulating screams all over again. Something came charging towards us, like a herd of rampaging bison. The forest began to shake and vibrate and rattle. My father hurriedly grabbed his rifle. He began indiscriminately firing off shots through the trees. He didn't know where to aim his rifle. We couldn't see a single thing through the tangle of foliage, shrubbery, and thorny briars. It was in that impossible moment I knew my father realized with a haunting clarity that we were in perilous danger, and the look on his face became fearful. It was like a dark shadow crossed over him, and that was when we saw the humongous dark figure sashaying through the trees towards us, and its fury was tangible. In seconds I realized we were seeing a Bigfoot. He was like a cantankerous old man. He was breathing heavily, gasping and spluttering, and I could tell he was old. But my God, he was powerful, an awesome-looking creature, like nothing I've ever seen before. And my father shot straight at him. But the Bigfoot merely bounced out of the way and grabbed my father's rifle from his trembling hands, breaking it into pieces, throwing it across the forest floor in abject disgust. And its parts just disappeared into the undergrowth and were swallowed up. I was so terrified. I stared in horror at this creature. I felt like an ant underneath an elephant's powerful foot, and that in seconds I would be pulverized by this thing and turned into powder. It was much larger than the Bigfoot I'd seen as a young boy, easily over 9 foot tall, covered in black flowing dark hair that was growing grey in areas around his face. The fact that my father shot at the Bigfoot enraged the creature to no end. He whipped my father up into his powerful arms and threw him against the tree so hard in retribution, and it happened so quickly. I doubt my father felt a thing. It was like being shot, I suspect. The way my father's head was slammed was so fearsome, so ferocious. It resulted in his face almost sliding off his head, like melted candle wax, and his head hung off his neck at a strange angle. I wanted to scream with all my might, but I could not. Nothing came out of my dry, parched throat that was throbbing in my chest. I had become like one of those fossilized trees with a petrified wood. I did not scream. I just stood there, waiting my turn, waiting to meet my end, waiting for this huge, powerful Bigfoot to hurt me like he'd hurt my father. But he did not. He turned around to look directly at me, and he appeared to be genuinely sad and reflective. He was disappointed that he'd killed my father, incredibly remorseful, and I could feel his subsiding anger was replaced by a very deep regret. I almost felt sorry for the creature. It was like he was saying, "What have I done? I didn't mean for this to happen." I found my eyes meeting his, sinking into their depths, and I knew he wasn't evil. His eyes were kind. I heard the audible English words flooding into my head saying, "Look what he made me do. I was so angry. I forgot my own strength. Your father was messing around with something he does not understand. I put the warning signs up. I spoke to him in his head, but he refused to let my voice in. He barricaded it. I'm sorry I've done this to your father, but I warn you, don't mess with what you do not understand, for your kind do not see what my eyes can see. For the light spectrum in your human eyes is greatly compromised. Your infrared frequency is crippled. It cannot see what my kind can see. You need to keep away." And with that he turned around and glided into the grove. And for a moment I stood there, like an ice statue at a banquet, not moving or daring to flinch. It was as if I was caught up in an outlandish, bizarre dream, from which I would surely waken. I wanted to wake up so badly. I wanted to wake up to know that this hadn't happened. But I knew that it had. Moments later, a dark shape emerged through the trees, and I recognized it to be the Bigfoot female that I'd seen once as a boy. She had a baby Bigfoot on her shoulders that was terribly cute. She looked so sad, so melancholic. She shook her head very, very regretfully, and I heard the kind words in my head. "I'm sorry my father did this. He didn't mean to hurt your old man. He was belligerently angry that you were messing around with the dark energy." I looked up at her, with tears spilling down my cheeks, and she whispered in my head again, "I'm sorry," and then she was gone. It was only after I saw my father's dead corpse hanging limply from the tree, with his face completely wiped off, that I ran home screaming at the top of my lungs. I told my mother exactly what had happened. She shook her head in annoyance. "What has your father done? Why did he not listen to me?" She claimed she had experienced a dream the night before, where she was told not to touch that part of the wood grove. She told my father about her prognostication and the warning voice that had spoken to her in her head. My father had willfully lied to my mother. He had told her he would not remove the trees from that area of the grove. She had taken him at his word, unfortunately telling my contrary, rather willful father not to do something always had the reverse effect on him, rather like a kid being told not to touch the chocolate in the larder, and then that kid stops at nothing to acquire it. I think my mother was cursing herself for not keeping a beady eye on my father, because she knew exactly what he was like. She kept saying, "I knew the man wouldn't listen. There is no fool like an old fool." She wasn't angry with the Bigfoot as you might expect, because she felt the creature did not know its own strength. But she could not continue living at our house after such a devastating tragedy, as it would only serve to remind her of her dreadful loss. Of course, we never did tell anybody else the truth about what had happened. Naturally, we told the people that rented our property from us that there may well be a capricious Bigfoot on the premises, who might have been responsible for my father's passing. We told them that with a great deal of apprehension, but we felt we needed to warn them. We chose, of course, not to tell them the absolute truth. That may have been too much to divulge, and would unlikely have been believed. Beyond our warning, We told them that if they left a certain part of the woodgrove alone, they should be all right, as we believed the Bigfoot did not want anyone messing around in that particular space. We escorted them to the part of the grove that they needed to avoid like the plague. Once again it was covered with all those ominous warning signs. I will admit it creeped the tenants out, although I don't think they believed for a moment that there really was a Bigfoot on the premises. One day the tenant, Mr. Mosley, phoned me up. It was probably about 3 years back, I think. I was not surprised to hear from him. He was always regularly keeping me updated about the condition of the house. If something needed fixing, he'd be in touch, as that's the problem when you rent out a house to someone, and it's another reason I chose to sell in the end. As if anything goes wrong while you have a tenant staying on your premises, more than likely you're expected to fix it. 3 weeks prior, Mr. Mosley had contacted me about a burst pipe, so I'd sent a plumber to the premises to sort the problem out for him. No questions asked, of course. I asked him if everything was all right, and much like you've done today, he asked me if he could meet up with me in Spokane for a quiet little chat. And as bizarre as it is, we were sitting at this very table I'm sitting with you now, drinking the very same craft beers. I remember thinking something bad had happened. What was he wanting with me? I was nervous about our rendezvous, as I hate mystery of any kind. In the beginning, as we were drinking beers together, he said to me, "I've got something to tell you, Chuck. Remember I was dismissive about your claims that there might be an angry Bigfoot on the premises? Because I never believed in the cryptic creature. I want to apologize for this fact." "There is no need for that," I said. "It's not my problem if you didn't believe me, and I'm not offended by it at all." It turned out Mr. Mosley wanted to share his experience with someone. I guess he knew I would believe him. Ostensibly he was afraid to talk to anyone about it for fear of being ridiculed, which was understandable, of course. Mr. Mosley is a CEO of a very influential company. The last thing he wanted was his credibility undermined, but he really needed to talk to someone about his experience. I guess he knew I would believe his account. He told me he'd never tell his wife or kids about what he'd seen. He was terribly afraid they would lose respect for him. At the time of his idiosyncratic, unorthodox encounter, that he never saw coming for a moment, he was nonchalantly walking in the woodgrove, clearing away some of the overgrown trees along the trail, as one of the branches had nearly thrown him off his horse, when it snagged into his shirt that he was wearing. He realized that they were constantly being scraped and scratched by overhanging branches on the trail that needed a trim and to be cut away, although he could have contacted me to sort the problem out, but he chose to do it himself. As he was doing all this with a measure of satisfactory success, he remembered our conversation from years back, and the strange symbols he'd seen on the trees, and I guess curiosity got the better of him. He privately wondered if the strange insidious signs would still be up all these years later. He thought he'd go and check it out for himself. I dare say he'd not been there for about 7 years or so. He told me that as he ventured to that part of the grove, it was like entering one rarely happy room filled with birdsong, and going into another sombre room, devoid of light and pretty birdsong. He told me this part of the woodgrove was bleak, as if a deep malevolent depression hung over it like a gloomy thundercloud. I had chills, he told me, real chills, and I knew in that moment I should not be there, especially when I saw a couple of upside-down trees, with their roots hanging in the air. It was bodeful, to say the very least. As I was standing there looking at all this stuff, I pulled off one of those strange decorations from the tree, and then I was hit with an overwhelming sense that something was watching me. I heard someone clearing their throat loudly. For a moment I was certain it was my wife. She was always clearing her throat due to her lactose intolerance. "Sadie? Sadie, is that you?" I called out to her. I looked around my immediate surroundings to see if I could detect any abstract movements. But nothing was there. I'm afraid the foliage in this part of the grove was dense and thick, with curtains of shrubbery, tangles of burgeoning creeper that crawled over trees indiscriminately. So yes, it was difficult to see anything. I nearly fainted when I caught a glimmer of what looked like a massive black shadow hiding behind a curtain of shrubbery, watching me through twinkling dark eyes. At first, my impression was it must be a bear. I stood still, my eyes focusing stiffly on the area. At this point, my heart was literally doing gymnastics in my chest, swinging violently backwards and forwards like a pendulum. And I was literally making fists with my hands, as my nerves were heightened. I'm not sure why I did not run away, but I did not understand why my adrenal response appeared to fail me. I knew something was there. There was no doubt about that. And that I was potentially in grave danger. That was when I observed a huge, thick hand pushing back the curtain of foliage like you might pull away a shower curtain when you exit the shower cubicle. And that was when I saw her. I nearly passed out from shock. Hand on heart, I was standing feet away from a female Bigfoot. I knew she wanted me to see her. There was nothing evasive about her. Indeed, she demanded my attention. I noticed her dark chocolate-coloured eyes were focused on the ominous grass decoration I was holding in my hand. She reached out to grab it, taking it from me, and promptly replacing it on the tree branch, as if hanging a Christmas decoration on a fir tree. It was all so surreal. I thought I was caught up in a dream. The thing was huge, but I was not fearful of her. Her energy was benevolent and gentle. What she did next amazed me. She spoke to me in an indigenous language that I did not understand. But for some reason, every word bounced into my head with an English translation. And I thought, what the hell? How does that happen so seamlessly? Even Google Apps can't translate like this.
Kilati kakwina, holota kila, bogolana. If you know what's good for you, you won't come here. I need to warn you to stay away from this place. It's really bad in this part. The energy is dark. Kolati kanakwa, hotolatila, nisakwani. I would advise you to touch nothing here. If you do as I say, no harm will befall you. And with that she glided away. When Chuck told me the extraordinary story about his tenant's interaction with a female Bigfoot, I was naturally amazed. "What do you think is going on in that part of the grove?" I asked him. "I have no idea, but it's best to stay away. And if you do, bro, there's no reason why you should not buy the property from me. The female Bigfoot seems to make herself known, to warn people not to mess with what they don't understand. So something about the land in that part is clearly off. And it seems these Bigfoots have outer-worldly powers. They know stuff beyond our grasp. I think they can see through the veil into other worlds and dimensions. It's the only thing that makes sense to me." It was good to see Chuck Warrington again, and I realized that when we were young we may not have had much in common, but things were profoundly different now. So I decided to buy the house that he'd lived in as a boy, but to also change my diet and enroll with some personal training sessions with Chuck in order to rekindle our friendship which I'm so glad I did, because these days we're the very best of friends. Of course, when I told my wife what Chuck had revealed to me about what really happened to his father, she was confounded. "It's such a sad story," she said. Me and my wife did not hesitate to contact the realtor, Mr. Foldforth, to put an offer in for the place, which Chuck had promised us he would accept. So against all the odds, things were just clearly meant to be. When we moved into the house, me and my wife settled into the place like a duck to water, and we knew the property would likely stay within our family for generations to come. I could not imagine selling such a spectacular property. Soon we had stable blocks on our property, occupied by 3 American quarter horses, and we purchased 2 lovable golden retrievers, Mercy and Starbright, who were devoted to my wife, possibly because she lavished so much attention on the pair and spoilt them rotten. For the first year we spent most of our time fixing the Warrington place to our liking, hanging up curtains as you do, and so I didn't give much attention to the Woodgrove, apart from using the horse trails to enjoy the odd ride here and there. One day after riding Red Rum, I realized that my watch that I'd been wearing for years was no longer on my wrist. It had fallen off during the ride. My wife had warned me to remove my watch from my wrist, as the leather strap needed replacing. I was now cursing under my breath, because it was an expensive watch, but also because it had been given to me by my deceased father, which made it all the more precious. He had given me the watch after I graduated from college, and I never took it off, as it made me feel close to him, and now it was lost, and I felt heartbroken. To say that I was upset about misplacing my watch is an understatement. I saw it as a connection to my dad, and with it gone, I felt almost as if I'd lost a part of him. It was one of the first times in my life I was almost close to tears. I was mad at myself for not getting the threadbare strap fixed. I knew the watch could potentially be anywhere on the premises, and to find it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Of course, it goes without saying, my wife gave me a right telling off. "I can't believe you! Did I not warn you that the strap was weak and was likely to break in any moment? I don't fancy your chances of finding it anywhere. The woodgrove is full of fallen leaves and overgrown shrubs, so how the hell are you going to find it?" "Don't you think I'm upset?" I said curtly. "Of course you're right. You're always right. I should have replaced the strap, but I didn't, and it's too late to cry over it." My wife looked at me sympathetically. She shook her head and said, "You wouldn't be in this mess, would you, if you actually listened to my sagacious advice and had replaced the strap?" Moments later, Chuck gave me a call. I told him that I'd misplaced my precious watch, and he had a great idea. "Listen, one of my clients is very keen on hunting for lost coins and stuff like that. His hobby is using metal detectors. He's managed to collect some rare coins over the years. I can borrow it from him if you like, and drop it off at your place for a couple of days' use. I'm sure he won't mind. He's a generous man. It'll increase your chances of finding your lost treasure, and I can help you look for it if you like. Don't give up hope, bro. I'm sure you will find it." "You really think a metal detector will help?" I asked him. "Why not? I mean, if you can recover ancient coins that have been buried for centuries, it must be much easier to find something above ground, surely," he said to me. When Chuck arrived at my house with a metal detector, I did not fancy our chances in finding my watch, but I was willing to give anything a go. Together we retraced my journey down the horse-riding trail, waving around the metal detector, which sometimes would go off, but alas, we just found old nails and a few coins that were regretfully not very ancient. I remember feeling this was a pointless endeavour. We were never, ever going to find my father's watch, as the sprawling trail was so large and wide, and there was so much ground to cover. How could we find anything that was missing? "Don't look so sorrowful," said Chuck, who was always more upbeat than I was. "I'm sure we'll find it. Try and think about when you were last wearing it. Try and visualize it in your head." "That's it, Chuck. I simply can't remember when I was wearing it last on the trail."
As I began to visualize my father's watch in my head, I continued to search the ground with the metal detector, and then I got the feeling that I was being watched, as if eyes were boring into mine. And then there she was, the female Bigfoot that Chuck had seen as a boy. But now I was seeing her myself, and in her hands, with her sausage-sized fingers, she held out my watch to me and said,
Kilani kwa, motalinu, kisala toi.
I think you're looking for this. And with that she nodded her head and glided away, before I could even say thank you to her. Chuck slapped me excitedly on the back and said, "That's the Bigfoot that I saw when I was a boy, and now you've seen her too. This is cool." I hasten to say it's been 5 years since that encounter, but I'm hoping that the Bigfoot will cross my path one day soon again. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.